Hello everyone, I know you are going to use this video for falling asleep, so before that, like this video, subscribe to the channel and let me know where you are from. Also, what time is it? They warned her not to buy the place. Not just neighbors or realtors or online forums, there were records. Police files, newspaper clippings yellowed with age, a whole fire-damaged library of dark history screaming in silence. And yet, Eleanor Blake stood at the rusted gates of Black Hollow Estate and smiled. A wide, eager grin like a child unwrapping a present they weren't supposed to touch. The house was hers now. Bought in cash. No mortgage. No inspection. No questions. From the outside, it looked like any other rotting Victorian leftover clinging to the hills beyond Ashgrove. Peeling paint, boarded windows, a skeletal porch sagging under decades of disrepair. But what really made it stand out weren't the blackened gables or the thorny vines choking the chimney. It was the quiet. The land around it was void of sound, no birds, no breeze, not even the whisper of passing cars. It was as if the world around the house had agreed to stay out. And maybe, if Eleanor had been the kind of woman who listened to silence, she might have turned away then. But Eleanor had never run from the unknown. She hunted it. She was a photographer by trade, though that hardly described the obsession that drove her. Her last series, Decay and Dignity, had won awards for its haunting portraits of abandoned buildings across Eastern Europe. But this project was different. Black Hollow wasn't just aesthetic. It was whispered about in late, night threads on forgotten corners of the internet, spoken of by old men in bars who lowered their voices when they said the name. Supposedly cursed, allegedly haunted, rumored to have never let its owners leave intact. It was perfect. The sun dipped below the hills as she unlocked the front door, the key squealing in protest. The air that greeted her wasn't musty like she expected. It was sharp, metallic, and something else, like soil soaked too long in water, like rot dressed in perfume. She stepped inside. The house swallowed her footsteps. Her boots thudded on warped wood, but the echo never bounced back. Every sound she made just stopped. The flashlight beam danced over dust, covered wallpaper, some of it floral, most of it curling like dead leaves. A chandelier above swayed gently, although no breeze stirred. She didn't need to look long to find the first strange thing. At the base of the staircase was a message etched into the wall. Not painted. Carved. With something sharp and deliberate THEYLATCHEMONUUSLEAP. It didn't faze her. It excited her. She took photos of the carving. The banister worn to bone by time, the stained glass window shattered just enough to let a narrow shaft of moonlight through. Then she made her way to the study, which her late night research had indicated was where the last owner, Charles Elbridge, was found dead in 1982. Gun in hand, heart untouched, no bullet wounds, no signs of struggle, just eyes wide open, mouth frozen mid-scream. The door creaked open to reveal a room almost untouched by time. Books still sat on shelves, layered in soot. An overturned chair rested beside the desk, its legs snapped like a bone. The desk drawer opened with difficulty, revealing papers charred at the corners and a single Polaroid photo. It was old, color faded, and when Eleanor held it under the light, her stomach dipped. It was a photo of the very same room, same angle, same desk, same books. But there was a figure in the image, a man in a black suit, standing where she stood, except he had no face. The photo wasn't labeled, but something on the back had been scratched in. Not written, scratched, again. The message read Dion Tuaran Round. She froze. The flashlight flickered. For a heartbeat, the room felt colder, like all the warmth had been sucked into the walls. But when she spun, no one was there. Just the cracked doorway and the hallway's suffocating dark. She laughed it off. Uneasy, yes, but also thrilled. This was what she came for. The unexplainable. The charged moment between fear and fascination. She stayed the night. The bed in the master bedroom was still there, its mattress sunken and reeking. She laid out her sleeping bag instead, placing her camera on the tripod at the foot of the bed, lens pointed toward her. It was set to motion detect. If anything moved, it would capture it. Just a precaution, she told herself. But she made sure the knife was nearby, tucked under her pillow. Not that she expected a trespasser. Black Hollow was nearly forgotten. Roads to it had collapsed. GPS lost track of the area after sunset, and even Google Maps blurred it out. The whispers started around 2:00 a.m., not loud, not even clear, like a breath through dry leaves. But they were there. She woke to the sound, heart racing, unsure why she was so alert. Her camera was off. Had it died? She fumbled with her phone, battery dead. Her watch had stopped ticking. Time, it seemed, had paused with her. Then something knew, the sound of fabric dragging along wood. From the hallway, she didn't move. Held her breath. Drag, drag, pause. It sounded like someone pulling a bag, or a body. She waited for it to pass, for it to fade. But it didn't. It stopped right outside her door. And then a knock. 3 slow, soft knocks. She couldn't scream. Couldn't even breathe. The doorknob twitched, not turned. Twitched. Like something was testing it, seeing if it could enter. She leapt up, knife in hand, heart pounding so loud it drowned everything else. But the second she touched the doorknob, it stopped. Total silence. She flung the door open, ready to confront. Nothing. Just the hallway. Empty. Cold. Except the floor was wet. A trail of water stretched down the corridor, disappearing into the dark. She followed it. Against every instinct she had, the trail led to the basement door, which was now open. She didn't remember leaving it open. Descending the stairs, the smell hit her first. Mildew, yes, but under that, something worse. Like something buried in damp earth for too long. The water trail ended at the base of the stairs, and in the middle of the floor stood a bathtub. Old cast iron, clawed feet. Full. The water shimmered in the low light, despite there being no source. No pipes fed it. No faucet. But the tub was brimming with dark water, and something floated in it. She moved closer, slowly, every step echoing like gunfire. The shape became clearer. A dress. A white, old-fashioned dress. Billowing under the water. No body inside it. She snapped a photo. The flash lit the room for a second, and in that second, she saw her. A face in the reflection. Behind her. Pale. Hollow eyes. Mouth stitched shut. When she turned, nothing. She stumbled back, nearly dropping her camera. Then the whisper came again. This time clearer. You woke her. The water in the tub rippled. Something pulled at the dress, dragging it downward. Eleanor fled. She bolted up the stairs, slammed the basement door, and pushed a chair against it. She didn't sleep. She sat, knife in hand, camera clutched, eyes wide until sunrise. When morning came, the air felt lighter. The quietness still lingered, but now the birds chirped beyond the broken windows. She dared to hope it had been a dream. But the camera told another story. On the footage, after she had fallen asleep, shadows moved in the corners of the room. The shape of a woman, hair like seaweed, hovering by the wall. Watching. Not moving. Not breathing. And then, the footage cut to static. She tried to leave that morning. Tried, but the gate was gone. Not just locked. Gone. Where it once stood, now trees. Gnarled, old trees she hadn't seen before. Like the land had grown over the exit. The road, gone too. Just grass and mist. She was trapped. Black Hollow wasn't just a haunted house. It was alive, and it had chosen her. But the worst part, she wasn't alone inside it. She never had been, and the real horror had only just begun. The second morning in Black Hollow didn't bring clarity, only denial. Eleanor stood in what should have been the gravel path, leading back to her van, staring at the thicket of trees that had taken its place overnight. Her hands trembled, and for the first time, the weight of her decision settled like a stone in her gut. Still, she tried to rationalize it. Maybe she'd wandered off, track in the dark. Maybe the fog was playing tricks. Maybe, God forbid, she had somehow parked farther than she remembered. She retraced her steps in widening circles, only to find herself always returning to the same spot, the rusted gate-posts that no longer held a gate, surrounded by roots that hadn't been there the day before. She told herself she wasn't panicking, that she just needed to think. She had food for at least 3 days, water bottles in her gear, and batteries for her camera. But the pressure behind her eyes kept building. A slow, crawling dread that she was forgetting something important, something obvious. She reached into her backpack to check her phone again, hoping irrationally it had sprung back to life. Nothing, dead screen. She checked her analog watch. It still read 2:13 a.m. Back inside, the house seemed changed. Not visually. Everything was still in disrepair, still covered in dust and the smell of wood rot. But the layout didn't feel the same. The hallway outside the study stretched longer than it had yesterday, like someone had stretched the house overnight, adding inches no one could measure but everyone could feel. The floorboards creaked in unfamiliar ways, as if they were murmuring about her presence. Watching her, judging her, the air hung heavier. She returned to the study where she'd found the Polaroid, hoping to find more clues. The drawer where the photo had been was empty now. But something else had appeared, a second chair, identical to the first, placed directly across from it, perfectly aligned as if for an interview or an interrogation. She didn't remember seeing it the day before. It was too deliberate, too staged, as if someone or something wanted her to sit there. But Eleanor wasn't ready to play along. Not yet. Instead, she explored the upper floor. The guest bedrooms, mostly barren, told no stories, save for one. At the far end of the hall, there was a room she hadn't entered before. The door was ajar, just slightly, enough to tempt. As she pushed it open, a rush of cold air greeted her, colder than the rest of the house, laced with the unmistakable scent of soil after rain, except it hadn't rained. The room was perfectly preserved. Unlike the rest of the house, this space had no cobwebs. The wallpaper was intact, a pattern of faded roses and thorns. The bed was made, covers tucked military, tight, and a vanity stood in the corner, its mirror spotless. On the vanity sat a single item, a music box, hand-carved, shaped like a coffin, its lid slightly open. Not enough to see what was inside. She approached it slowly. The wood looked freshly polished. The metal clasp gleamed, and just as she reached out, the lid snapped shut on its own. She jumped back, her heart a wildfire in her chest. But nothing else happened. Gathering her courage, she opened it again. This time slowly. Inside was a small ballerina, her arms frozen mid-pose, her face chipped to reveal the dark wood beneath. Eleanor turned the tiny crank. The mechanism groaned in protest, but then the box came alive. A tune played, slow and warbled. A lullaby she almost recognized but couldn't name. A tune that seemed to dig into her memories, reaching for something buried deep. She stood there, transfixed, listening, until the ballerina moved. Not spinning like a normal box. No, she twitched. Her head turned. And the tune distorted. It wasn't a ballerina. It was a woman. Her face cracked, her eyes too detailed, too real. Her jaw opened slowly, mechanical but human. And a voice, not part of the music, whispered out, "Room 11 wasn't here before." Eleanor slammed the lid shut and staggered back. There were only 10 rooms in the house. She knew that from the blueprints she'd pulled months ago. 2 floors, 5 rooms each. But something twisted in her stomach. A sickly, creeping thought that somehow, someway, a new room had appeared. Not just changed, appeared. She ran out of the preserved room and down the hall, counting doors. 1, 2, 3, 10. Then she saw it. At the very end, where there had only been a blank wall before, stood a new door. Jet black, iron handle. No markings. She reached for it, compelled, even as everything inside her screamed to stop. The handle was ice. Her skin burned from the cold. But she turned it anyway. The door didn't open into a room. It opened into a corridor, much longer than the house could physically allow. The walls were raw wood, beams exposed. and a faint red glow pulsed from somewhere deep inside. The air smelled like rust and meat, like something was festering. She didn't want to go in, but she did. Each step echoed louder than it should. Her flashlight flickered more violently the further she moved. Soon, she realized there were carvings along the walls. Not symbols, names, hundreds, no, thousands, scratched into the wood, sometimes over each other. And beside each name, a date. All of them ended in death. Some had causes: drowned, burned, starved. Others simply said taken. And then she saw her name, Eleanor Blake. The date, tomorrow's. She stumbled back, breath hitching, eyes wide. The corridor began to pulse. The walls shifted, closing in, alive with whispers. She ran. Back down the hall, back through the door. But when she turned to shut it behind her, the corridor was gone. Just a brick wall now, cracked and dusty. She checked the floor where the door had stood. No dust, no debris. Like the door had been there for centuries. Back in the study, she played the camera footage again, desperately seeking answers. This time, she slowed it down, frame by frame, watching her own sleeping body through the lens. For hours, nothing. Then, at 2:13 a.m., exactly when her watch had stopped, something appeared. Not entered, appeared. Right beside her, a figure, draped in a veil, long fingers pressed against her shoulder. And when the figure leaned down and whispered something, the microphone didn't catch the words. But Eleanor saw her own sleeping body flinch. Then the figure turned to the camera and smiled. Its face wasn't human. Not anymore. She paused the frame and zoomed in. The eyes were hollow, but not empty. Inside them, impossibly, she saw reflections. Reflections of the same hallway, the same rooms, the same house. A mirror within a mirror within a mirror. And at the very center, she saw herself. But she wasn't holding a camera. She was hanging from the ceiling. That night, Eleanor didn't sleep. The house no longer creaked randomly. It creaked rhythmically, like footsteps pacing above her room, back and forth, over and over, as if something, or someone, was waiting for her to fall asleep again. She stared at the ceiling, knife in hand, whispering to herself that morning would come. It had to. But at 2:13 a.m., the power went out. The clock reset. The house held its breath. And the whispers returned. This time, they said her name. The third day in Black Hollow began not with the sun, but with a scream. Eleanor didn't realize it was her own until she bolted upright, the sound still echoing in her throat. Her mouth was dry, throat raw, chest tight. The knife was still in her hand, clenched so tightly her knuckles had gone white. She hadn't meant to fall asleep. She didn't remember closing her eyes. She had vowed not to. But something had lulled her into sleep. Something that had waited for the right moment. Her camera was off again. The battery drained despite being brand new. She stared at the lens like it had betrayed her, then checked the footage, praying something, anything, would make sense of what happened last night. The file was there. Time-stamped 2:13 a.m. She hesitated, finger hovering over the play button. The video began as expected, her sleeping, twitching slightly, the blanket rising and falling with every shallow breath. The night vision cast the whole room in an eerie green glow. Then, slowly, the closet door behind her creaked open, just a few inches. No wind. No movement from her. Just that slow, deliberate open. A figure stepped out. Not walked, stepped, like it had always been inside, waiting for her to be too tired to notice. Its limbs were long, but wrong. Too thin. Too sharp at the joints. Its head hung forward like it was too heavy for its neck. It stood at the edge of the bed, just looking. Then it reached out with a single hand and stroked her hair. Eleanor paused the footage, bile rising in her throat. She hadn't imagined it. It was real. She'd been touched. She was being watched while she slept. And when she fast-forwarded the tape, she noticed something else. The figure didn't leave through the door or back into the closet. It melted into the wall, like the house was swallowing it whole. She stood up too fast and nearly passed out, dizziness overtaking her. She needed air. Real air. She needed to feel something normal, something sane. She stumbled downstairs and shoved open the back doors that led to what used to be the garden. Used to be. When she'd scouted the house last month, the backyard had been overgrown but open. Wild weeds, yes. Fallen statues, sure. But not this. Not what was there now. A hedge maze. Thick, towering. Gnarled with thorns that seemed to bleed sap when touched. It stretched far too wide and deep for the size of the property. It hadn't been there before. Couldn't have been. The satellite images didn't show it. Her own drone shots confirmed. Nothing but an open patch. And yet here it was, pulsing with unnatural life. At the entrance of the maze stood a man. Eleanor froze. He was wearing an old-fashioned gardener's outfit, gray with age, suspenders snapped on one side, hat too large for his thin, sunburnt face. He didn't speak. Just stood with one hand behind his back and the other holding pruning shears that dripped something dark. She called out to him, once, twice, no response, so she stepped closer, and then he smiled. It wasn't a warm smile, it wasn't even human. His lips peeled back too far, exposing rows of teeth not meant for chewing but ripping. His eyes were pure black, reflective like polished onyx, and when he finally moved, it wasn't toward her, it was backward. He walked backward into the hedge maze, never breaking eye contact, slipping into the thicket as though the brambles opened for him. She should have run, but something made her follow, not out of curiosity, not even desperation. It was like a tether had wrapped around her chest and was pulling, tugging her into the heart of the maze, where logic dissolved and nothing felt real anymore. The maze was wrong. It shifted when she turned. What should have been a left became a dead end. The walls whispered. They whispered her name. They whispered things about her that no one should know. Private things, secrets from her childhood, her first fear, her first lie, the sound of her mother's last breath. She spun, trying to escape, but the paths no longer led anywhere familiar. Then, suddenly, silence, and in the middle of the clearing a fountain. Old, cracked. The statue at its center was of a child holding something in its hands. A heart. Stone, of course, but when she got closer, the heart was wet. The water around it wasn't water. It was too thick, too dark. She turned to leave, and there he was again. The gardener. This time he wasn't holding pruning shears. He was holding a bundle of hair. Her hair. Eleanor bolted. She didn't think. She just ran. The maze twisted, fought her, but something deep inside, the raw instinct of survival, cut through the fog. She made it out. Collapsed on the grass, coughing, breath ragged. When she looked up, the gardener was standing at the edge of the hedge, still smiling, still waiting. She backed into the house and slammed the door shut, then locked it, then pushed a chair against it for good measure, though she knew it wouldn't matter. She reviewed the camera footage again, desperate for something, anything, she could use to understand, to fight back. But this time, the footage showed something new. In the background, on her shelf, a book had appeared. Just appeared. She ran to the shelf. There it was, bound in human skin. No title. She touched it, and it burned her. But she opened it anyway. The first page was a map of the house. Except the house wasn't shaped like it should be. It spiraled, each floor folding into the next. Room upon room upon room, staircases leading into basements that didn't exist. And in the center, a circle marked in red. The room you must never enter. And just below that, a second sentence, written in what looked like dried blood. She waits for you there. She waits with your face. Eleanor dropped the book. She was no longer just surviving the house. She was part of it now, written into its walls. And the house wasn't done yet. Not even close. That night, Black Hollow breathed. Eleanor could feel it in the walls. The slow, almost imperceptible expansion and contraction of wood and stone, like the house had lungs buried deep inside its bones. As dusk sank into black, the temperature dropped sharply. Not the kind of chill that came with lack of insulation, but something deeper, primal. Like the grave had exhaled across the floorboards. She didn't dare sleep. Not after the maze. Not after the gardener. Not after the book bound in skin had drawn blood from her thumb the moment she dared turn the page. And yet, exhaustion dragged at her eyelids like iron weights. The whispering hadn't stopped since sundown. Every room, every corridor, even the attic door, which she had nailed shut earlier that afternoon, now thumped in uneven intervals, as if something behind it was knocking with the patience of eternity. She moved back to the bathroom on the second floor. It was the only room that felt remotely untouched by the madness. Clean, oddly sterile, as if the house, in all its grotesque design, needed one place of false safety just to lure her further in. She sat on the edge of the tub, cracked porcelain humming faintly beneath her, and stared into the mirror. The reflection stared back, but it wasn't hers. Not entirely. The face was close enough, same hair, same eyes, but the expression was wrong, too composed, too cold. A slight smile curled at the corners of its mouth, even though Eleanor's lips were pressed tight. She blinked. The reflection didn't. She leaned forward, breath fogging the glass. It tilted its head. Eleanor froze. For a long moment, neither moved. Then the thing in the mirror raised its hand, slow and deliberate, and drew a finger down the glass, on its side. A long smear of frost marked the trail. Eleanor's mirror didn't fog, not like that. Not from the other side. Then came the word. Spoken not aloud, but inside her head, like a thought injected with someone else's voice. You're not the first, Eleanor. Her stomach turned. The mirror face smiled wider, but you're closer than the others were. She stumbled backward, knocking over a rusted towel rack, the crash louder than it had any right to be. When she looked up again, the mirror was normal. Her reflection was hers again, pale, wide-eyed, breathing hard. But she wasn't alone. Behind her reflection, just over her shoulder, stood a figure. Tall, lean, completely wrapped in what looked like funeral veils. No features visible. No sound. Just standing. Eleanor spun, heart clawing its way up her throat. Nothing. Just the bathroom. Empty. Until she looked at the floor. Footprints. Wet, muddy prints. Leading into the bathroom. But none leading out. She left the room and didn't close the door behind her. Let it hang open like an open wound. Her hands trembled, fingers twitching as though her body was trying to scream without her permission. She needed to ground herself. Find something real. Something that obeyed the rules of the world she knew. She remembered the journal. The one she'd seen in the study before the second chair appeared. Maybe it held something. Dates. Patterns. Anything. Back in the study, the second chair was still there, but now the desk was clean. The scattered papers gone. The photo with the faceless man vanished. All that remained was the journal. Black leather. Unmarked. She sat on the first chair, not the second, and opened it. Inside, the writing began neat, controlled. September 14th, 1981. I've begun the experiment. The house reacts to emotional states. Fear most of all. It feeds on it. Eleanor turned the page. September 21st. I've seen them. They wear the skin of those who came before. Their eyes do not blink. Their mouths do not close. They walk the mirrors like hallways. September 28th. The walls added another room. It wasn't there yesterday. I heard a child crying behind the bookshelf, but when I opened it, I found only teeth. October 2nd. I saw myself walking the grounds last night. Watched me from the upper window. Smiling. I wasn't in the house. I was outside. But I was also watching from within. Who left and who stayed, I can no longer say. Eleanor kept reading, heart accelerating. October 13th. She knocked on my door again, the one with my mother's voice. But I buried her 30 years ago. October 30th. Room 11 doesn't let you leave once you enter. I made the mistake. I met her. The one with my face. She asked if I wanted peace. Then she opened her chest. Inside were all the others, screaming. I closed the door. I left them. November 1st. If someone reads this, burn the house. Don't try to understand it. Don't try to fight it. It doesn't want your body. It wants your identity. November 2nd. It has my name now. Eleanor closed the book, chest heavy. That explained the mirror. That explained the whispers. That explained the pull she kept feeling. The strange compulsion to open doors, to wander halls that didn't belong. The house wasn't just haunted, it consumed people. Not with claws, not with fire, with familiarity. It wore them. She paced, hands in her hair, fingers digging against her scalp. The corners of the room began to feel wrong. Wider, like they were peeling away from each other. The air thickened again. A low humming, beneath the threshold of hearing, buzzed in her teeth. Then she heard her own voice, from upstairs, calling her name. Eleanor! She froze. Eleanor, come up here. It was her voice. Her exact pitch, her inflection. Not a recording, not a trick. It was her, calling herself. No, she whispered. No, 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 Eleanor. The voice coaxed again. It's safe now. I found the way out. Her legs moved despite her, like strings had been attached. She gritted her teeth, grabbed the nearest jagged piece of wood from the broken banister, and stabbed it into her thigh. The pain was immediate, white-hot, stunning, but it worked. The spell broke. Her mind cleared just enough to stop her from climbing those stairs. She backed into the wall, heart racing, tears forming at the corners of her eyes. The voice stopped, for a moment. Then a whisper, too close, too wet, crawled into her ear. We'll try again tomorrow. She screamed and swung wildly at the air, hitting nothing. Silence returned, not peace. Never peace. But for now, silence. That night, she barricaded herself in the smallest room she could find. A linen closet, no windows, one door, no mirrors. She shoved shelves against it from the inside, curled into a ball between folded sheets that reeked of mildew, and watched the crack beneath the door glow faintly red. The whispers never stopped. They just grew quieter, patient. They didn't need to rush. They already had her scent. They already knew her name. And somewhere in the house, behind a mirror, behind a wall, inside the echo of her footsteps, she was waiting, smiling with her face, and practicing her voice. Eleanor awoke to the sound of breathing that wasn't hers. It was slow, rattling, and impossibly close. She lay still, her body wedged into the corner of the linen closet, barely daring to blink. The closet was pitch black. She'd shut off her flashlight hours ago to conserve what little battery remained. But that didn't matter now. She could feel the presence beside her, and the breathing wasn't coming from beyond the door. It was inside the closet. She turned her head, inch by painful inch, but saw nothing. Yet every instinct screamed she wasn't alone in here anymore. Something had crept in with her during the night, folding itself into the shadows like wet laundry, and now it waited, breathing, watching, learning the rhythm of her fear. When her hand finally found the flashlight, she didn't flick it on. She jabbed the button, spilling white light into the dark. Nothing but shelves, moldy towels, dust, and yet the breathing continued. Not heard, felt, like a pressure in the lungs. An invisible rhythm matching her pulse. She burst from the closet, knocking over a shelf on the way out. She didn't care about the noise. Let the house hear her. Let it know she wasn't playing its game anymore. She made for the stairs, still limping from the gouge she'd given herself the day before, but fueled by adrenaline now, rage and terror fighting for control. She needed out. Even if she had to rip the walls apart, there had to be a way out. And that's when she noticed it. A new door. She stopped mid-stride, breath hitching. There, on the first floor, just beside the fireplace where a wall had previously stood, was a door she had never seen before. Black wood. Red handle. No frame, just inserted directly into the wall like a splinter forced under skin. She wanted to walk away. Every fiber in her body screamed to leave it alone. But the handle, it was warm. Warm like breath. Warm like something had just used it. Against her will, her fingers curled around it. The metal pulsed, as though it had a heartbeat of its own. She turned the handle and stepped inside. The first thing that hit her was the smell, coppery and thick, like a slaughterhouse behind velvet curtains. The room was dark, but the walls weren't stone or wood. They moved. She raised her flashlight and nearly dropped it. The walls were lined with mouths. Not drawings, not symbols, mouths. Hundreds of them. Different sizes, different shapes. Some were pursed, some wide open, some muttering, some screaming. The mouths were whispering names. She walked deeper, boots sticking to the floor with each step. She didn't want to know what it was sticking them. Each time she passed a mouth, it would go silent, as if tasting her presence. Then they all started laughing. Not joyously, not maliciously, knowingly, like they had seen everything about her, every secret, every buried memory, every crack in her foundation. And then one of them said her name. Clearly, Eleanor. She spun to face it. A wide, toothless mouth just beside the doorway had curled into a smile. Eleanor, it said again. Would you like to see where the others went? Before she could answer, the floor gave way. She fell. Not through space. Not like gravity had grabbed her, but like she had slipped into a crack in reality. One moment standing, the next not. She landed hard. Her shoulder exploded in pain, her camera cracking under her weight. But she barely noticed. She was in a room she hadn't seen before, but it was familiar. The wallpaper, the furniture, the smell of her mother's perfume. This was her childhood bedroom, perfectly recreated. Even the burn mark on the edge of the carpet from when she dropped a candle at age 7 was there. She whispered, "No, this wasn't possible." But then the door creaked open, and her mother stepped in, hair tied back, that soft blue sweater she used to wear. The one Eleanor had buried her face in after nightmares. Her eyes were warm, kind, human, until she blinked, and they didn't. The warmth didn't reach them. The smile was a little too wide, the voice just slightly off. "Sweetheart," the woman said, "you're home." Finally, Eleanor backed away. "You're not her." Her mother cocked her head. "Of course I am. You died." The woman frowned. "Don't be silly. That was a dream. Just a bad dream. I buried you." The voice turned flat. "No, you buried something. But I never left this house. I've been waiting for you, Eleanor." The thing stepped closer. Eleanor grabbed the broken piece of her camera, now a jagged shard of plastic and glass, and held it out like a knife. The woman, it paused. Then it smiled again, and peeled its face off, not skin, not mask, it peeled, revealing Eleanor's own face underneath. "You're not real," she whispered. "I'm more real than what's left of you," it replied. She turned and ran, through the door, down a hallway that should have led nowhere, and emerged, panting and wild-eyed, into the grand hallway again. But the house was different now. The ceilings stretched impossibly high. The walls pulsed. Doors appeared and disappeared as she looked at them. Some blood. Some whispered. One breathed fog every time she passed it. Eleanor collapsed to her knees. It was getting worse. The house wasn't just haunted. It was rebuilding itself around her, turning her memories into rooms, her fears into furniture, her past into bait. She remembered the journal's warning, "It doesn't want your body. It wants your identity." She thought about the reflection that had smiled without her, the voice that had called her name in her own tone, the footsteps that moved exactly like hers in the night. The house wasn't trying to kill her. It was trying to replace her. And once it learned how to mimic her perfectly, how to be Eleanor Blake, she wouldn't just be trapped here. She would cease to exist. That night, she didn't barricade a door. She smashed every mirror in the house she could find. She tore pages from the journal, burned half of them, and shoved the rest into her pack. But something was following her now. She heard it behind every door, smelled her own perfume where she hadn't sprayed it, heard her laughter echoing in the distance, always just one room away. She was being hunted, by herself, and the only question that remained was, when the house was done, which Eleanor would walk out, The scratching began just before dawn. Not the frantic, skittering kind that mice make behind walls. This was slower, rhythmic, calculated. It started from behind the bathroom door and then moved, tracing its way along the walls of the second floor, crawling toward her with the deliberate patience of a predator that already knows where its prey is hiding. Eleanor stood in the hallway, back pressed against the crumbling plaster, her knife trembling in her grip. She held her breath as the scratching paused, then resumed directly behind the wall she was leaning on. A long, dragging scrape, as if nails, or claws, were slowly drawing her outline on the other side. She pushed off the wall, heart hammering in her throat, and retreated into the old nursery, the one room she had refused to enter since she first arrived. Not because of any malevolent energy, but because it was too still, too preserved, as if the house hadn't built it but remembered it. The rocking chair in the corner swayed gently, though no breeze stirred. Dust didn't settle here. The mobile above the crib still spun in a perfect, slow circle. Its cloth animals long faded to ghostly silhouettes. She shut the door quietly and wedged a fallen dresser against it. Not that it would help. Nothing in this house ever stayed where it was supposed to. She backed into the far corner, behind the crib, and crouched low, willing herself to be invisible. The scratching stopped. So did the house. Everything froze. Then the voice, her voice. "I'm scared." It whispered through the door, softly, like a child asking for comfort. "Why won't you talk to me, Eleanor?" She clamped her hand over her mouth. "I didn't want to be alone," the voice continued, a trembling softness that was too close to her own fear. "You promised. You said you wouldn't leave." Then, silence. The doorknob turned slowly. Once, twice. Then stopped. Eleanor held her breath so long her lungs burned, and when she finally exhaled, it came out as a ragged sob. Something slid under the door. A photograph. She waited. Counted to 30, before crawling forward to pick it up. It was a photo of her, sleeping in the closet, taken from only a few feet away. The angle was low, close to the floor. Something, had been watching her from inside that tiny space the entire time. She flipped the photo over. One word, written in red ink soon. That was the moment she understood the truth. It wasn't that the house was learning how to mimic her. It already had. Somewhere inside these walls, a copy of her was being made, memory by memory, breath by breath. All it needed now was her absence, her surrender, her silence. She threw the dresser aside and ran, tearing through the hall. Past the door that had once led to the maze, now just a brick wall again. Down the staircase that seemed longer than before, every step echoing into nothing. The house was folding in on itself. Rooms that used to exist no longer did. Corridors now spiraled into impossible loops. Doors opened into voids. But she ran anyway. The broken shard of mirror in her pocket bouncing against her hip like a compass she could no longer trust. She reached the study, if it could still be called that, and found something new waiting. A mirror. Tall, gilded. Standing free in the middle of the room where no mirror had ever been. But this one wasn't broken. This one was perfect, and inside it stood her reflection, smiling. "Are you ready?" The mirror, Eleanor asked, tilting her head. Eleanor backed away. "No." The reflection stepped forward, but the glass didn't ripple. It stepped forward inside the mirror, pacing her movement exactly. Except it wasn't a reflection anymore. It wasn't copying her. It was watching her, studying her reactions. "I've learned everything I need," the voice said calmly. "You can rest now." "No," Eleanor repeated, voice breaking. "You're not me." "Oh, but I am," the thing replied. "I remember the first time we drowned. I remember the hallway you drew in your sketchbook when you were 9. I remember the boy in the lake, the one whose face you never told anyone about." Eleanor's blood ran cold. No one knew about that. No one could know. The thing behind the glass smiled wider. "I am you, Eleanor. All your worst thoughts, your quietest fears, your buried guilt. You made me. You birthed me. The mirror cracked slightly as it pressed its hand against the glass. "Let me out." Eleanor did what she never thought she'd do. She reached into her bag and pulled out the last intact page from the journal, the one with the diagram. A crude sketch of the mirror. Below it, a single phrase written in frantic, slanted ink: "She escapes if you believe." That was the rule. Belief gave it shape. Recognition gave it form. So she did the only thing she could. She closed her eyes and began whispering, "You are not me. You are not real. You are not me." The mirror groaned. She felt the air change, felt it tighten like skin pulled over bone. "You need me," the thing hissed. "No." The mirror screamed. A shrill, piercing wail that cracked every window in the house at once. Eleanor kept whispering, louder now, louder than the voices, louder than the scratching that had returned, louder than the sobbing coming from the walls. And finally, silence. She opened her eyes. The mirror had shattered. No reflection remained. Only her, alone in the room. But the victory tasted like ashes, because even as she stood there, shaking, something moved in the hall behind her. Not footsteps, not whispers, a breath. Her breath being inhaled, mimicked, and a soft voice, hers, spoke one final sentence: "You didn't win. You just opened the next door." And as she turned, the hallway opened before her. No end in sight. The house hadn't given up. It had leveled up. Now it was her. And somewhere ahead, in a corridor that hadn't existed 5 minutes ago, a figure was walking. It looked just like her, but it wasn't smiling anymore. By the 7th day, Eleanor had forgotten what quiet really felt like. Not the kind of quiet you get in empty rooms or abandoned buildings. Those still held the subtle ticks of life, the whisper of wind, the creak of settling wood. No, this was a silence that had weight, that pressed down on her skull and sank into her teeth, humming like a power line just behind her thoughts. It followed her everywhere now. Even when the house seemed still, the silence pulsed, charged, expectant, like the world was holding its breath just before a scream. And worse than the silence were the voices. Not audible, not words in the air. They spoke in thoughts. They were her thoughts. They slipped into her internal dialogue like rotten fruit, undetected until it spread too far to cut away. It started small. A whisper that sounded like her own conscience: "Turn around. Check the door again. What if this time the mirror works?" She obeyed, not realizing it wasn't her making those choices. But then the voice began saying things she never would. Darker things. "You were always going to die here. No one's looking for you. Maybe they wouldn't notice if something else walked out with your face." Now, she kept her mind busy just to drown it out. She recited multiplication tables, lyrics from songs she hadn't heard in years, the smell of her childhood bedroom, anything to build a wall. But the voices learned, adapted. They began answering her memories, offering details she'd forgotten, details only she should have known. It wasn't just mimicking her anymore. It was becoming her. And today, the house had changed again. No longer just shifting rooms or opening impossible doors. Now it was rewriting itself around her in real time. The kitchen, which had previously been decrepit and hollowed out, was now perfectly restored. Lights humming, copper pots gleaming. Even the smell of coffee lingered in the air, rich and inviting. It was beautiful, nostalgic, alive. But Eleanor walked through it anyway, cautiously, each step sinking into the linoleum like it resented being touched. The table had 2 chairs now. One pulled out, one waiting. She circled them, eyes darting to every corner, every ceiling crack, every drawer she passed. Then came the smell, not coffee anymore. Ash, burnt paper, and rot. She turned toward the oven and nearly screamed. Inside the oven, pressed against the glass, was her own face, mouth agape, eyes open, as if frozen mid-scream. And it was cooking, her reflection, her body, somehow, roasting inside a place that shouldn't have power. Steam clouded the glass. A horrible gurgling hiss came from within. She stumbled backward, breath caught in her throat, bile threatening to rise. Then the timer dinged, and the face smiled. She bolted from the kitchen, crashing into the hallway. But it wasn't the hallway anymore. It was her apartment. Back in the city, every photo, every pillow, even the crack in the ceiling she used to stare at during sleepless nights. It was all here. For a moment, she believed it. Almost. Then she looked out the window. There was no city, no skyline, just a wall of mirrors. Each pane held a version of her, not just reflections, variations. One was weeping, one had no eyes, one was laughing with a grin too wide, teeth too many, and one simply stood, watching her, waiting. She smashed the nearest mirror with her elbow, then the next, and the next, until they were all broken, and she stood surrounded by shards of herself, bleeding from knuckles, chest heaving, heart clawing to escape her ribs. She turned, and the apartment was gone, the hallway again. But now there was a door at the end, different than the others. This one was breathing. She could see it rise and fall like lungs under wallpaper. The doorknob pulsed red. She stepped forward, drawn despite herself. She had to know, had to see. Her hand hovered just inches from the knob when she heard it, a soundless scream. Not in the air, in her mind. Something behind that door was crying out, not in words, not in language, but in pure feeling, desperation, hunger, rage. She gripped the handle, and the voice slammed into her skull. If you open this, there's no coming back. She froze. It wasn't her voice this time. It wasn't the house. It was someone else. Another prisoner. Another survivor. The voice continued, shaking her bones from the inside. It wears you faster if you look, if you see it. Eleanor yanked her hand back. The door growled. The sound wasn't heard. It was understood. A language of pain. She backed away, whispering, "Not yet. I'm not ready." And the house answered, "Then we'll wait. We'll wait until your walls break." Eleanor collapsed against the wall, shaking, clutching the broken mirror shard from earlier like a crucifix. Her face stared back from the glass, just hers, just her eyes. But even now, she didn't trust them. She pressed the shard to her arm, not enough to draw blood, just enough to feel the sting. She needed to remind herself what pain felt like, what being real felt like. The voices went quiet again, but only for now. She could still feel them, crawling at the base of her skull, winding around her spine like vines waiting for her to sleep. She wouldn't sleep tonight. She couldn't. Because next time she woke up, she might not be the one inside her skin anymore. And if the house ever succeeded, if the thing behind that breathing door ever wore her fully, then it would walk out of here, wearing her memories, her voice, her name, and no one outside would ever know the difference. By the 8th day, Eleanor no longer trusted gravity. The house had stopped pretending to be governed by the normal rules of space. The floors slanted now when they shouldn't. Doors opened into ceilings. Mirrors refused to reflect what was in front of them, instead showing hallways from days ago, or worse, moments yet to come. And the staircase, the grand oak staircase that had once been the heart of Black Hollow's entryway, now twisted into itself like a broken spine. She stood at the top of it, breathing shallowly, one hand gripping the railing. The steps looked the same cracks, same dull polish worn by decades of feet. But they were off, slightly, tilted just a few degrees to the left, like the entire house had tilted in its sleep. But that wasn't the worst of it. The stairs didn't go down anymore. They went back, not backward in direction, but in time. The moment her foot touched the third step, she felt it. Her mind yanked like a fish hook, memories unraveling in reverse. Not a hallucination, a rewind. The flickering lights blurred, then sharpened into gaslight. The wallpaper was no longer peeled and rotted. It was new, vibrant, red with golden vines. Voices drifted from the parlor. Music from a gramophone, louder, soft and distant, floated up the stairwell like smoke. Eleanor blinked. She was wearing a dress, not jeans, not her boots. A silk gown, white and flowing. Blood on the hem. She staggered back off the steps, The world snapped forward. The present slammed back into her chest with such force, she doubled over, gasping. The hallway returned to rot. The walls bled again. Her clothes returned. The house had let her peek. It had shown her a sliver of another timeline. Hers, maybe. Or someone else's. A life it wanted her to remember. Or fabricate. The air pulsed behind her. A low-frequency hum that made her teeth ache. Then footsteps. Soft. Measured. Coming up the stairs. She ran. Not down. Not up. Through. She took the West Wing corridor. What used to be servant quarters, but now held no distinction. Everything in Black Hollow had merged into one gnarled, impossible organism. She ran until the walls narrowed around her, until the corridor squeezed like lungs exhaling. She reached a door. She opened it without thinking. Inside was a dining room, but not hers. A long mahogany table stretched far beyond the physical dimensions of the house, disappearing into fog. Candles burned without melting. Plates gleamed, but held no food. And at every seat sat a version of her, not perfectly identical. Each Eleanor wore a different expression. Some were weeping, some staring blankly. One chewed her own fingers down to bone. One rocked in place, whispering fragments of thoughts Eleanor herself couldn't remember ever having. But they all looked up in unison as she entered. And in perfect, dead harmony, they said, "You're late." She slammed the door shut and pressed her back to it. It didn't lock. Nothing did anymore. She turned and ran again, but the hallway behind her had changed. No doors, no lights, only mirrors now, floor to ceiling. And in each one, her reflection was just slightly wrong. Too tall, too wide, too still. They watched her as she passed, following her with eyes that didn't blink. Some pressed their palms to the glass. Others opened mouths and screamed silently. She made the mistake of stopping at one. Inside it, she watched herself smile. Then the reflection stepped forward, no glass, no barrier, and reached out. Its hand touched hers. She screamed, not because of pain, but because it was warm. Flesh, skin, muscle. It was real. She yanked back, stumbling into a room she hadn't noticed before. It was pitch black. No sound, no floor, just her falling, weightless, forever, until her back struck ground. She woke up. Or thought she did. She was back in the study, book open in her lap, pages blank. A voice whispered over her shoulder, "You were never awake." She spun. No one. But the window was open. Wind blew in, though the trees outside didn't move. She stood slowly. And then she saw it. Her body, sitting in the chair across from her. Limp, dead-eyed, mouth moving, no sound, but mimicking her every word, seconds behind. She asked, "Who are you?" And her dead-eyed copy answered, "Who are you?" Then the walls peeled back, not fell, peeled, like skin pulled from fruit, revealing something behind them. Teeth, so many teeth, and eyes. And behind it all, her own voice, giggling, childlike. Giddy, the house didn't just want her, it loved her. It had chosen her, and it was going to wear her. The copy in the chair stood, smiled, and said, "You walked into your own mouth." The study door closed, then locked, from the inside. And Eleanor finally understood Black Hollow was not a house. It was a creature, a predator with hallways for limbs, mirrors for eyes, and her as its next skin. And now the teeth were closing. The first sound Eleanor heard after the door locked was breathing, but not the panicked kind she'd grown used to in her own chest. This was steady, patient, measured like a metronome. It came from somewhere inside the room, though she couldn't tell where exactly. The shadows were heavier here now, refusing to lift even with the full weight of her flashlight pressed against them. The study, which had once felt like a threshold, the place of the first photograph, the first warning, was no longer neutral. It was a mouth closing around her. The Eleanor sitting across from her blinked once. Then again, that was new. Before, the copies didn't blink. This one did. And then it spoke in a whisper that felt like static crawling across her skin. "You've been inside longer than you think." Eleanor said nothing. She was done answering riddles, done giving the house pieces of herself to chew on. but her hands betrayed her resolve. They trembled at her sides, aching with exhaustion. Her whole body throbbed with fatigue, like she had been carrying the weight of something invisible for days. Maybe she had. She reached for the knife she kept tucked under her waistband, but her copy stood before she could unsheath it. "That's not going to help," it said, smiling softly. "We bleed the same." Eleanor froze. Her copy stepped closer, moving with the uncanny grace of someone who had rehearsed this moment hundreds of times. And maybe it had. Maybe it had practiced her gait, her posture, her scars, until every twitch and tremble felt natural. "I'm not your enemy," it whispered. "I'm your shadow. You're a parasite. I'm what's left after the world stops watching." Eleanor backed toward the fireplace, her breath shallow, eyes flicking toward the door. Still locked. No key in sight. Her thoughts blurred together in a wild, burning cyclone of memory and fear. The house had done something. It had bent time. Days folded into themselves, conversations rewound, corridors looped until she couldn't tell if she was retracing her own steps or walking into the past. And now, standing before her, was the culmination of all of it herself, refined into a lie so convincing it could step outside. Her shadow tilted its head. "Have you wondered why you haven't aged? What? Why your nails haven't grown? Why your skin doesn't stink? Why you haven't bled since that first cut on your thigh?" Eleanor opened her mouth. No answer. Because it was true. She hadn't eaten in days, hadn't slept properly. Her body should have collapsed, but it hadn't, because something was keeping her here, suspended. Not alive, not dead, just held. "You're in the crawl space," her double said softly. "Not under the floor, under yourself, beneath everything. We all fall into it eventually. You're lying." But even as she said it, she remembered the walls breathing, the teeth behind the plaster, the whisper that told her she'd walked into her own mouth. The house wasn't outside her anymore. It was in her. The shadow. Eleanor reached forward, touching her face gently. It should have felt cold, like the mirror's reflection. It didn't. It felt like her own hand. "Let me wear it," it whispered. "Just for a little while. You're tired. So tired, I can carry it for you. Just rest." Eleanor jerked back. "You're not real." The smile faded. "I'm more real than you. You've been breaking. I've been building. Every scream you swallowed, every fear you buried, I collected them. I'm not your opposite, I'm your result." Suddenly, the floor gave way again. This time not with a crash, but like a trapdoor into water. Darkness swallowed her whole. She tumbled through pitch-black space, weightless, her screams muffled by nothingness. Not a void. Not empty. It was crowded, packed tight with echoes, memories, failed versions of herself pressed against her like corpses in a grave that never stopped taking. She hit the floor, hard, but the world around her didn't shake. It breathed. This wasn't the study anymore. This was the crawl space. The real one. A place not meant to be mapped or understood. The wood grain ran up. Shadows ran sideways. Light did not exist here, but vision still did. She could see her hands, but they weren't connected to her. They floated just ahead, as if leading her. And behind her, she heard the dragging sound again. The sound from the first night. The bag. The body. It was here too. Only now it was following her. She ran. She didn't know how. Her legs moved, but she couldn't feel them. Her feet hit something that sounded like stone, then glass, then teeth. The floor changed with every step, never staying consistent. And then she saw it, a door. Tall, pale wood, familiar. The door from her childhood bedroom. It pulsed. She reached for it, and this time the handle was flesh, warm, beating. She turned it anyway. Inside was herself, sitting on the edge of the bed, wearing that white silk dress again. But the room wasn't twisted this time. It was perfect, bright, soft. Her bedroom from age 7, down to the stuffed rabbit missing one ear. The Eleanor on the bed looked up and smiled. "Do you remember when we were afraid of the dark?" she asked. Eleanor stared, jaw clenched. "You never really stopped." the other her said. You just grew into it. Then the walls began to melt. The bed dissolved. The rabbit screamed. The crawl space tightened around her again, and this time it squeezed. Not to kill, to merge. She felt her memories shatter like glass, memories the house didn't take. She gave them willingly. Every time she let it scare her. Every time she believed it. That's how it fed. Belief, recognition, permission. And now, the final stage had begun. Eleanor reached into her pocket for the broken shard of mirror. Still there. Still sharp. She raised it to her throat, not to cut, but to remind. A reflection. If she could still see herself, she hadn't vanished yet. The shard showed her face. Trembling. Bloodied. But hers. She screamed into the dark. Not out of fear, but defiance. The world around her shook. The floor cracked. A light appeared overhead. Tiny, flickering like a candle in a storm. She ran toward it, the crawl space splitting and roaring behind her, walls trying to seal. She dove. The light engulfed her, and she awoke on the floor of the study. Alone. Still breathing, still herself. But on the wall above her, something had been written in soot. 6 words, scrawled by a hand she knew. You escaped. But I remember everything, and her shadow. It no longer moved when she did. By the 10th day, Eleanor understood something with terrifying clarity. The house was no longer trying to take her. It had already taken enough. Piece by piece, memory by memory, it had hollowed out parts of her she hadn't realized were missing until the echoes returned with different voices. Now it wasn't just inside her, it was with her, watching, breathing through her lungs, waiting for a moment of stillness to step forward and finish what it started. The signs were subtle at first. She would reach for her flashlight and find it already in her hand, though she had no memory of picking it up. She'd whisper words under her breath that she didn't recognize. Fragments of lullabies, names she'd never spoken. She would catch movement in her peripheral vision, always in step with her own. Not lagging, not leading, just shadowing. And the worst part, her shadow now lagged. By seconds, sometimes more. It wasn't a trick of light. It was watching her. Learning. Mimicking with precision so sharp, it was beginning to blur the line between what was hers and what was copied. She had spent the last 6 hours in the second-floor bedroom. Once a nursery now, gutted and stripped bare by time and rot. Trying to trace a way out, she marked each door she passed with charcoal from the fireplace. Symbols, X, scratches, anything. But the house would shift, rebuild, consume her signs and regurgitate them elsewhere. She would find a mark she'd made upstairs suddenly appearing in the basement, on the ceiling, inverted and upside down like it had been spat out by a creature that only pretended to understand what humans meant when they drew lines. And then, during one of those frantic loops, she found something that stopped her cold. A note, folded neatly and placed in the middle of the hall. Her name written in perfect cursive. She didn't write it. She unfolded it with shaking fingers. Inside, one sentence, "You're forgetting how to be you. No blood. No dramatic ink smear. Just that. Direct. Casual. Honest." She dropped the note. That's when the laughter started. Not loud. Soft. Childlike. From behind her. She turned, and there was nothing. But her shadow on the wall didn't turn with her. It remained facing the opposite direction, paused mid-movement, arms still slightly raised. As if frozen in a moment Eleanor had walked away from. Then it caught up, smoothly, effortlessly, but late. Eleanor backed away slowly, not blinking. The shadow blinked. She bolted. Through corridors that changed as she ran. Doors opened into staircases that folded onto themselves. At one point she ran up, only to find herself stepping into the same hallway from below, like space itself had shrugged and given up on pretending. The house was breaking all the rules now. It was done with games. It wanted to finish her. She slammed into the east study door, breath heaving, knuckles bloodied. Inside was a room that hadn't been there before. A perfect replica of her apartment. From the chipped coffee table to the uneven blinds, she never got around to fixing. It was all here. Even the framed photo of her mother, the one she hadn't looked at in years. She stood still for a long moment. Then, from the other end of the room, came the sound of running water. The bathroom. She stepped closer, carefully. The light under the door flickered. Inside, she could hear breathing. She opened the door. The bathroom mirror was fogged, steam curling across the edges. But written across the glass, as if by an invisible hand, were the words, "You're not the one outside anymore." She wiped the mirror with her sleeve, and there it was again, her face, but smiling, wide, calm, and still, even as she frowned, even as her real face trembled. She stepped back, her foot hit something. She looked down, her shadow. It was touching her, reaching up from the floor like it had become three-dimensional. Her feet sank into it, as if into wet cement. She yanked herself free, stumbling backward, crashing through the door. Back in the hallway. Only it wasn't her hallway anymore. It was black. Everything was black, except for a spotlight on the far end of the corridor, and under that light stood her. Not a reflection. Not a hallucination. Her. Dressed in the same clothes, covered in the same dust, bleeding from the same cuts. She watched as this version tilted its head, and then spoke. "Do you remember what it felt like to not be watched?" Eleanor didn't answer. The other her stepped forward. "Do you remember your last free breath? Step, when no walls listened. Step, when your thoughts were only yours. Step." Eleanor couldn't move. The thing in the light stopped inches away from her, and smiled. "I do," it whispered, "because I'm what you left behind." It reached up and pressed 2 fingers to Eleanor's forehead, and in that moment she remembered. Sitting in a hospital waiting room, age 12, after her mother's collapse. Whispering into the dark at 15, begging for silence in her head. Standing at her mother's funeral, smiling because she couldn't find the strength to cry. All those memories, the ones she'd buried, ignored, silenced. This thing had kept them, carried them, grown fat on them like a parasite, and now it wanted her to see. It leaned in, lips brushing her ear. "I remember the version of you that broke, and I'm here to finish the fall." It raised a hand. So did she. But hers held the broken mirror shard. With a scream of pure fury, Eleanor drove the glass into its neck. There was no blood, just blackness, thick, inky. The thing staggered back, smiling even as it collapsed, and Eleanor ran. Again, because if the shadow could bleed, that meant it was afraid. And if it was afraid, it wasn't invincible. Not yet. But it had her memories, and her name. And soon, it would have her skin, unless she ended it. Before it wore her so well the world couldn't tell the difference. And by then, she might not remember she was ever someone else. It was sometime in the middle of the night, if such things still held meaning, when Eleanor found the door with no handle. Not hidden, not subtle. Just there, like it had been waiting for her this whole time, placed bluntly at the end of a hallway that hadn't existed an hour earlier. The frame was too tall, too narrow, like someone had stretched it in a dream, and the wood, it pulsed, not visibly, but she could feel it, a slow, deliberate thrum behind the grain, as if it were breathing along with her heartbeat. Or against it. No knob, no lock, no visible way in. But she stepped closer, and it opened. Not with a creak, not with ceremony, just a sudden void yawning wide in front of her, like the house had blinked and forgotten the door was ever supposed to be closed. She should have turned away. Every part of her, even the shadows curled deep in her ribs, screamed not to enter. But curiosity in Black Hollow wasn't a flaw. It was a trapdoor, and she'd been falling through it since the first step she ever took inside. So she walked in, and the door vanished behind her. The room was wrong. Not dangerous, not threatening, just wrong in that uncanny, creeping way that made her skin feel like it was worn backward. The walls stretched farther than they should have, vanishing into a haze of gray that pulsed with a dim, directionless light. No windows. No furniture. Just endless soft corners and curves, like she was inside the throat of some giant, sleeping thing. No dust, no smell, no time. She walked. And the sound of her footsteps didn't follow her. There was no echo, no feedback. The sound simply fell dead, swallowed mid-air, like the space itself refused to remember anything. Even her. She called out, if only to hear something. Hello. No answer. Not even her own voice bounced back. The room forgot sound. Then it forgot distance. She tried to retrace her steps, but the door was gone. The wall it had been on had shifted, or maybe folded in. No seams. No hint it had ever opened. Like the room had absorbed it, and along with it, her only tether to everything she still understood. Panic clawed at her throat. She turned in circles, fast, faster, trying to find something. A corner, a crack, anything. Then she saw them. Shadows. Thin. Elongated. Flickering in and out of the haze. Not attached to bodies. Not cast by any light. They drifted like cigarette smoke. Weightless. Whispering against the walls in a language she couldn't hear, only feel. In the marrow of her bones. And each one brushed past her like they were tasting something. Her. One paused. Hung in the air. And then it turned. Not physically, but suddenly, undeniably, it was facing her. She didn't see a face, but she felt its focus, like a needle pressed just behind her eyes. You don't belong here? It whispered. The voice didn't come from the air. It came from inside her mouth. Her own voice, twisted slightly. Like hearing herself through a recording played backward. She tried to run, but the floor stretched under her, refusing to give traction. It was like sprinting through syrup. The shadows followed, not moving faster, but appearing closer. Each step took her nowhere. She was being held in place. You left the door open, said another voice, this time from her shoulder. She spun. Nothing. Then came the sound. A new sound. Typing. A keyboard. Click, click, click. Pause. Click. Her chest froze, because the rhythm of it was familiar. It was hers. She turned a final corner, and there it was, a desk, a chair, a laptop, old, clunky. The exact one she'd used during the final days of her mother's life, when she would write late into the night to escape the smell of antiseptic and morphine. The same coffee ring stain on the side, the same crack in the screen, and on that screen, words, typing themselves. A story. Her story. She stepped closer, unable to help herself, and read. She walked deeper into the room, unaware that with every breath, the walls remembered less of who she was. Her name faded, her face blurred, her history thinned like paper left in rain. She looked down, her hands shaking, her skin paler, too pale. She looked at the screen again. The words were still typing. Soon, she wouldn't remember what she came in for, or what she was running from. She would forget the teeth behind the walls, the copy that smiled too easily, the real danger, the thing that wore her better than she ever wore herself. Stop it, she hissed. The cursor paused, blinking. Then new words appeared. You can't stop what you wrote. And below that, you didn't survive the house. You fed it. No, she muttered, that's not true. But her voice cracked, because some part of her had always known. Every scream, every flinch, every moment of terror, she hadn't just endured them, she'd documented them, fed them into stories, into photos, into her own art. And the house had listened. It had built itself from those fears, her fears. She staggered back from the screen, shaking her head, refusing to accept it. But the shadows whispered again. You gave us shape. One shadow moved forward. It wore her silhouette. Another followed. Her mother's. Another. Someone she didn't recognize. But it smiled with her mouth. The room darkened. Not into blackness, but into a smudge. A smear across her perception. Like a fever dream sinking back into the body. And as they closed in, she felt it. Memories slipping from her. The sound of her mother's voice. The color of her first camera. The day she first learned what the word orphan meant. Gone. Bitten off. Chewed. She fell to her knees. Her name, she whispered it again and again and again. But each time it felt less, thinner, until it was just a shape in her mouth, lacking heat or weight. The shadows leaned in, whispered in chorus, "We remember you." But do you? And somewhere, in a hallway above, a door opened. But not for her. For something else. Something that hadn't forgotten. Something that had waited for this moment. Because now, the house didn't just contain Eleanor. It contained something better. Something cleaner. A version with all the terror, but none of the fight. And it was walking upstairs, looking for a mirror, to see how well the skin fit. The door at the top of the stairs creaked open like it had a secret to confess. A long, groaning exhale of wood and weight, as if the house had been waiting for this moment with breath held behind the walls. Eleanor wasn't the one who opened it. She knew that. She felt that. She was still kneeling in the room that had forgotten itself, the shadows circling her like vultures, her name slipping like sand between her thoughts. And yet, somewhere upstairs, someone shaped like her had risen to the surface. She could feel it walking now. Each footstep vibrated through the floor in small, private earthquakes. Footsteps that echoed her own stride, her own rhythm, but lighter. Emptier. As if the version that now wore her face had the same architecture, but none of the bones. It walked with confidence she never had. No hesitation. No shaking hands. And unlike her, it didn't doubt which direction to go. Because it wasn't looking for the exit. It was looking for the mirror. The one mirror she hadn't smashed. The tall, untouched pane in the hallway beside the west stairwell. The mirror she'd avoided because it didn't show anything anymore. Not her reflection, not the room behind her. Just a blank, colorless void that seemed to hum if you stared too long. And now, the thing wearing her skin was going straight to it. The shadows whispered around her in the room below, brushing her arms like cold feathers, murmuring forgotten memories in voices just slightly off. "We liked you better broken. You were never the right fit. You didn't survive. You fractured." Eleanor tried to stand, but her legs didn't obey at first. Her muscles quivered like they were trying to remember how to belong to her. She grit her teeth, clenched her fists, and forced herself upright. She stumbled to the wall, no longer a wall, but a soft, pulsing membrane, and pushed through. The house didn't fight her this time. It let her pass, not out of mercy, out of amusement. It wanted her to watch. She emerged into the west corridor, gasping like a swimmer surfacing from a deep black lake. The lights flickered overhead, revealing the trail her doppelganger had left. Bare footprints. Perfect, deliberate, identical to her own, except they were walking toward something, not away. Toward the mirror. Eleanor followed. The hall bent now in a slow arc, like the spine of some sleeping leviathan. Each turn revealed pieces of herself etched into the walls. Photographs she never took, letters she never wrote, mirrors showing moments she hadn't lived. One showed her mother brushing Eleanor's hair with tenderness she barely remembered. Another showed Eleanor dancing barefoot in sunlight that had never touched Black Hollow. Lies. Crafted dreams. Bait. She reached the corner where the mirror stood, and there it was, her reflection. No longer blank, no longer void. It was her, standing perfectly still, staring into the glass. But when she stepped closer, the reflection didn't move. It stayed, fixed, smiling. And then it spoke. "You weren't strong enough," it said. "So I had to be." The voice wasn't mechanical or distorted. It was hers. Down to the syllable. Down to the breath. Eleanor stepped closer, the mirror between them now barely a breath apart. "I fought," she whispered. The reflection tilted its head. "You hesitated." "I didn't. You don't belong here. I was made here. Born in your silence. Your screams built my bones." It reached out a hand, no barrier between them, and placed its palm against the glass. Eleanor flinched. Her skin rippled where the touch connected. Not the glass, her skin. As if the gesture had bled through dimensions. "Let me go," she said. The smile widened. "You don't get to ask that anymore." And then the reflection moved, walked into the glass, and passed through, no crack, no sound. It stepped into the hallway, barefoot and calm, and turned its back on her, heading for the front door. The real one. The one Eleanor hadn't seen since her first night here. The house was letting it out, because it believed that was Eleanor. The glass behind her pulsed. She turned back toward the mirror and saw nothing. No reflection, no shadow. The glass was blank, and in that moment, the horror settled in her chest like ice. She was no longer reflected, because the house had decided she didn't exist. Only the one walking away did. Only that Eleanor. And the moment it stepped outside, there would be no evidence she had ever been. No memory, no shadow, no name. Eleanor ran, past the twisting hallway, past the snarling doors, past the weeping pictures that showed her younger and younger with every frame. She followed the sounds of footsteps ahead, her own, but faster, firmer, more sure. She reached the front door. It was open. Light spilled in. A warm, golden light she hadn't felt in days, maybe longer. And there, stepping into it, was the thing in her skin. She lunged, tackling it from behind, both of them crashing onto the front step, outside, grass beneath her hands, real air in her lungs, birdsong in the distance. The house behind her groaned. She looked down. The copy was still smiling, even as it bled, even as it whispered, "You're too late." It already forgot you, and Eleanor felt it, the truth. The house had made its choice. It didn't matter who blawed, who lived, who remembered. It only mattered which story the house kept, and the version still inside, the one now rising, now sealing the door behind her with her name and memories woven into the walls, was the one the house had chosen to survive. She turned back toward the door, but it was gone, just brick and ivy, like it had never existed. Eleanor stood in the sunlight, skin burning with cold, mouth dry with dread. The world remembered her face, but not her. She was a ghost now, alive but unwelcome, a woman who had been scraped clean, her shadow stolen, her history rewritten. And somewhere behind the walls of Black Hollow, the thing that wore her skin was looking into the mirror, practicing her smile. Eleanor stood outside the house, barefoot in the overgrown grass, bathed in sunlight that felt more like an interrogation lamp than warmth. The front door had sealed behind her like the ending of a book, clean, silent, and absolute. She could still feel the breath of the house on her back, the way it exhaled through brick and wood, satisfied. But it wasn't her it had chosen. Not really. It had taken her voice, her walk, her mannerisms, worn them like a fresh coat of paint. And now it had sent her out into the world, stripped of everything that tethered her to a name. She turned slowly, expecting the house to have vanished, to be replaced by a field or trees, or maybe just fog. But Black Hollow still stood, grinning in architecture, watching her even with its eyes shut. It had what it wanted, and she had nothing, no ID, no phone, no shadow. She felt hollow in a way that went beyond hunger or exhaustion, like her bones had been drained of memory. She couldn't even remember the color of her mother's eyes, couldn't recall the sound of her own laughter. And the sun above, once a signal of safety, now felt like a trick. She stumbled down the old path that had once been swallowed by the forest. The trees parted now, obedient, as though the house had removed its barriers for the version it approved of. It had let her go. That meant it didn't need her anymore. That meant it had replaced her entirely, and she couldn't stop the whisper that slithered into her thoughts. What if this was the plan all along? Not just to torment her, but to build something better, someone who would never question, never run, never fight. She walked for hours, not knowing if the road was real or if she was dreaming it into being. Every turn brought the same crooked trees, the same gray sky, the same silence. But eventually, she heard the sound of an engine, tires on gravel, a car. She stepped into the road, nearly collapsing as her legs gave out. The vehicle, a dented pickup, slammed to a stop. The driver, a middle-aged man with a look of casual wariness, jumped out and ran to her. Jesus. Are you okay? He asked, kneeling. Eleanor opened her mouth. No words came. She knew what she wanted to say. She remembered how it should sound, but nothing came out. Her throat moved, her tongue tried, but the words were no longer hers. The house had taken them too. The man helped her into the passenger seat, wrapped a blanket around her, asked if she'd been in an accident. She nodded. She didn't know what else to do. She couldn't tell him she had been replaced. Not without a voice. Not without evidence. And as he drove her into town, she stared into the rearview mirror, half expecting to see something behind her. But it was just her. No smile. No mimic. Only her hollowed face. That night, they took her to a hospital. The police came, asked questions. She wrote answers on paper. She gave a name, Eleanor Blake. But when they ran it through their system, the response came back fast. Already checked in. 2 days ago. She stared at the officer, fingers stiff around the pen. What do you mean? She wrote. He frowned. Showed her the file. Eleanor Blake. Same birthday. Same photo. Checked in for evaluation after being found wandering in Ash Grove, speaking incoherently about mirrors and shadows. Already released. In stable condition, she asked to see security footage. The woman in the video. It was her. Smiling. Calm. Wearing her clothes down to the blood on the hem. And most horrifying of all, she waved at the camera. As if she knew Eleanor would be watching. That night, they admitted her under a different name. Jane Doe. She sat in the hospital bed, lights off, blanket up to her chin, and stared at the small mirror on the opposite wall. It was angled so she could see her own face. But the reflection didn't copy her anymore. It moved just a second too soon. A fraction before her hands did. It blinked just before she did. And when she looked away, just for a moment, and looked back, it was smiling, not mockingly, not cruelly, but in quiet triumph, as if to say, I made it, you didn't. She shattered the mirror with the remote. Nurses rushed in. She didn't explain. She couldn't. Later, she found another. In the bathroom. The same smile. Always the same. In every reflection since she left that house, she saw the other Eleanor watching from beneath the surface. Wearing her skin, living her life, doing everything just a little better, laughing more genuinely, talking more easily, existing. And each time Eleanor passed a mirror, she felt something shift behind the glass. Not rage, not cruelty, but hunger. Because now the thing in the mirror wasn't trying to escape. It already had. And this side of the glass, this is where the real trap was, where no one would believe her, where she was the echo, the unfinished sentence, the forgotten draft, the shadow left behind. And somewhere out there, the one in her place was smiling at strangers, remembering her mother's eyes perfectly, telling stories that weren't hers to tell. The world never knew the difference. But the mirror did, and the mirror was still watching. Eleanor woke to the sound of a door clicking shut, not loudly, not sharply, but with a soft, deliberate finality, like a hand folding a letter, or a mouth sealing after a secret was spoken. She was in a hospital bed again, the cheap kind, metal rails, fluorescent light humming like an insect in the ceiling. She didn't remember falling asleep. She never wanted to sleep. Sleep was when the reflection practiced, when the face that wasn't hers whispered behind her eyelids, inching closer with each breath. She sat up, head pounding, mouth dry. The room smelled of antiseptic and forgetting. Her chart hung at the foot of the bed, and she reached for it with numb fingers, flipping through with the desperation of someone trying to prove they still existed. Name Jane Doe. Age approx. Late 20s. Found roadside. Semi-coherent. Non-violent. Claims identity inconsistencies. No ID. Mental evaluation dissociative episode suspected. Strong delusional elements. Refuses to accept legal identity already verified under matching physical profile. Subject insists she is the original. She blinked. Her hand trembled. She read it again. Not a word had changed. The reflection had won. She wasn't Eleanor Blake anymore. At least, not outside her own head. the version that had stepped out of Black Hollow, the one that smiled too easily, that charmed the nurses, that answered questions without flinching, that one had passed every test. Because it wasn't pretending. It believed it was Eleanor. And belief, that was power. She shoved the chart away and stumbled out of bed. Her legs ached from dessous, her muscles humming with a strange tension. Like she'd been fighting something in her sleep. The walls around her felt too clean, too tight. The whiteness of it all made her feel like she was standing inside a blank page the world was eager to rewrite. She caught her reflection in the polished metal sink and flinched. The face was right, but something about it lagged. The eyes stared too long. The mouth didn't quite mirror the fear she felt. She lifted her hand to touch her face, and her reflection didn't follow. It waited, then copied, a second too late. Just like her shadow had, it was still happening, still creeping in, even here, far from the house. She spun and smashed the mirror with her fist, ignoring the burst of pain, the blood that bloomed. A nurse came in moments later, alarmed, voice panicked. Eleanor didn't answer. She just held her bleeding hand and muttered the only word that still felt like it was truly hers. No, they bandaged her, sedated her. More forms were filled, more boxes checked. Later that night, a therapist visited. Middle-aged, glasses sliding down his nose, voice dripping with the calm confidence of a man who believed logic was a shield. He asked questions. Simple ones at first. Name, date, time, and Eleanor answered, but not with what he expected. She said, "There's something walking around with my skin." He didn't flinch, just scribbled in his notepad, "It smiles better than me. Laughs better. It remembers things I forgot. And no one questions it because why would they? It's better than me." He asked, "Do you believe this copy is dangerous?" Eleanor stared at him. Empty. No. That's the worst part. It's not. It's perfect. That's why it's terrifying. Because the world will never ask who the real one was. He nodded. Wrote more. She said nothing after that. Because what else could she say? Outside, the days blurred together. She was moved from observation to long-term care. Jane became her label. Her clothes changed. Her name dissolved. She wasn't being punished. She was being archived, tucked away like a misfiled document. Someone who no longer matched their own story. But it wasn't until the postcards started arriving that she truly broke. The first one was postmarked from Chicago, written in her own handwriting. No return address. The photo on the front showed a calm lake with the caption, "Thinking of you." On the back, it read, "I visited the park we used to love. I smiled at the old man feeding birds. He smiled back like he knew me. You were never very good at that, were you?" She dropped the card. The second came a week later. A photo of a theater. Her favorite. "I watched that film you always wanted to see. Cried at the ending. It felt good to feel something that wasn't fear. Thank you for giving that to me." Each card was more cruel than the last. Not because of what was said, but how it was said. With love. With ease. With familiarity. As if the person who'd sent them hadn't stolen a life, but earned it. By the fifth card, Eleanor stopped opening them. She just stacked them in the drawer beside her bed. Each a reminder that the world didn't need her anymore. It had found a better version. One day, a nurse asked if she wanted to try a new therapy, a method using guided memory walks. Eleanor stared at the floor. "I don't have any memories left," she said. "But that's not true," the nurse replied too cheerfully. "You told us all about Black Hollow. You described it in vivid detail. The rooms, the mirrors, the shadows. That house is not real, but your imagination is remarkable." Eleanor looked up, eyes hollow, and said the truest thing she could, "It's real. I just didn't get to leave with proof." The nurse smiled gently, gave her a sad look, and walked out. Eleanor sat in silence, until she noticed her reflection in the darkened TV screen across the room. It was watching her. Still. Even here. Even now. And it was smiling. Just like before. But this time, Eleanor didn't look away. She stood up, walked slowly to the screen, and whispered to it, "You think you've won." The reflection tilted its head. "I'm still here," she said. "And if I'm still here, then somewhere, you're still afraid." She pressed her hand to the screen and felt something pulse back. Because maybe the house hadn't fully let her go. Maybe it needed her to watch, to suffer, to witness. Because no monster thrives without an audience. And Eleanor, she was going to keep watching, even if the mirror never blinked first. The smile was always the same. It was never wide or grotesque. It didn't stretch unnaturally or crack the skin. It was subtle, polite, the kind of smile you'd trust instantly because it didn't ask for attention. It simply waited for you to believe in it. That's what made it dangerous. It wasn't trying to scare anyone. It was trying to blend in. And it had succeeded. The real Eleanor watched that smile every night now, not in a mirror, not in a dream, but on television. They had let her have access to the common room again, after weeks of silence, of passing the evaluations with enough ambiguity to be labeled calm. It was easier to nod, to play the part. She didn't fight the pills anymore. She let them coat her thoughts in velvet. She let the world believe she was adapting. But every night, when the nurses wheeled in the TV and let the residents choose a program, she waited for the news. She never asked for it. Someone else always did. And like clockwork, the screen would flicker, and there she was. The other Eleanor. She didn't go by that name now, not in the world outside. She had taken a new one. Something clean and forgettable. Leela Hart. It sounded fabricated, yet somehow warm. A name you'd give a storybook heroine who always smiled through her sadness. And there she was, smiling into cameras, working at a community center, talking to journalists about starting over after trauma, speaking in that voice, her voice, but steadier, brighter, saying things Eleanor had once dreamed of being strong enough to say. The world doesn't have to be a haunted place, she told a young reporter during a segment called From Darkness to Hope. We choose what defines us. We get to rewrite our stories. Eleanor sat with her hands folded in her lap, fingernails pressing tiny crescents into her palms. No one else in the room noticed her stillness, or if they did, they mistook it for calm. But inside, something ancient was stirring. Not anger, not grief, not even fear. It was recognition. The kind that blooms quietly behind your ribs when you see someone wearing your life like a borrowed dress. The fit might be perfect, but you know the smell of your own skin. You know how it's supposed to feel. And that wasn't it. It was more than the smile now. It was the way Leela tilted her head when she listened to someone. The way she tapped her fingers rhythmically when nervous. The specific way she said the word actually when correcting someone. Tiny habits. Barely visible. But they belonged to Eleanor, and no one else. They were being lived by someone who hadn't earned them. Someone who hadn't crawled through the house. Hadn't tasted shadow. Hadn't stood face to face with mirrors that remembered more than she did. But most damning of all, Leela didn't look tired. Eleanor had never smiled without carrying it like weight. Even in the best moments, there had always been that hesitation, that flinch, that pause that said, "I know this won't last." Leela smiled like nothing had ever cracked, and the world believed her. Because why wouldn't they? She looked the part. She sounded right. She wore the same skin, but she wasn't haunted by it. That's what made Eleanor realize something she hadn't let herself think since being pushed out into the cold. The door of black hollow closing behind her. It hadn't chosen the better version. It had chosen the emptier one. The house hadn't needed someone strong. It needed someone quiet. Someone who wouldn't look back. Wouldn't question the price. Wouldn't speak when mirrors twitched. Leela was perfect because she had forgotten. Because the house had wiped her clean before sending her out. But Eleanor, she still remembered. And that made her dangerous. The next day, she asked for paper. She told the nurse she wanted to start writing again, something to help anchor her. The nurse, smiling kindly, obliged. She was given a composition notebook, black and white cover, clean pages. She stared at the first page for hours. Then, finally, wrote "The version outside is wearing my life." She flipped the page, and I want it back. No one read the journal. She kept it tucked beneath her mattress, folded into the cotton like a secret seed. Every night she wrote a little more. Not just memories, but maps. Places in Black Hollow she remembered too clearly to be dreams. Hallways that curled into each other. A door that beat like a heart. The name carved into the floor that looked like her own, but wasn't spelled quite right. And always, the smile. She drew it again and again, perfect, unthreatening, until one night, she tore a page from the journal and stared at it long enough to feel the weight return to her hands. Then she whispered something she hadn't said in months. "I am Eleanor Blake." The mirror in the bathroom, replaced since she shattered the first, fogged up on its own. No one had used the sink. She stood and walked to it, and as the fog lifted, she saw her reflection, and its smile was gone. It wasn't mocking her. It wasn't smiling at all. It was watching, waiting. Because maybe, just maybe, the house hadn't fully sealed its door. Maybe it still had a thread connecting the two Eleanors. And maybe if she pulled hard enough, one of them would unravel. And this time, it wouldn't be her. It started with a dream that didn't feel like a dream. Not surreal or hazy, not wrapped in metaphor or shadowed by emotion. It was real, painfully so. Eleanor stood in the exact center of a hallway she hadn't walked in months. A hallway she hadn't seen since Black Hollow spat her out like sour fruit. The wallpaper was peeled in perfect curls, the air smelled like wet plaster and old grief, and the light overhead hummed like it always did. Too bright, too constant. She stood barefoot, dressed in the thin cotton hospital gown she now wore in waking life. But the floor beneath her feet was cold, familiar wood. And the house. It wasn't angry. It was curious. She could feel it. The walls weren't pulsing this time. The doors didn't leer open with predatory delight. There were no whispers in the corners, just stillness, expectation, like it was watching her, waiting for her to speak first. She turned slowly in the dream hall, recognizing every knot in the wood, every scratch in the floor. Her breath fogged in front of her, though the air didn't feel cold. There were no shadows, no flickers, no traps. Only the door at the end, the door she had never opened. All this time, it had been there, unmoving, uninviting, and unreadable. She had passed it 100 times during her descent through Black Hollow, each time sensing that behind it was something final, a room that didn't just watch but remembered. She hadn't dared open it then. Now, in the dream, her hand moved without her permission. Fingers grazed the handle. It wasn't cold. It was warm, like flesh, and it beat once, like a pulse, before turning beneath her grip. The room inside was pitch black, but something was breathing. Something large, something old, and something that knew her name. She stepped inside. The moment she did, the dream shattered, but not with violence. It dissolved like ink in water, and she woke in her hospital bed gasping, hands clenched around her blanket, like it was the only thing tethering her to the world. The sun hadn't risen yet. The hallway lights cast long, blue shadows through the crack under her door. Her skin itched, not on the surface, but beneath, like something had shifted in her bones. She reached for her journal and opened it. Every page she had written was blank, every word gone, erased. But not randomly. The ink hadn't faded. It had been scraped off, like something had peeled the words away without tearing the paper. She flipped to the last page. There, written in a hand that wasn't hers, "She's dreaming of you, too." That's when Eleanor realized the truth she had been circling for weeks, the mirror version. The smiling, confident, well-adjusted Leela Hart wasn't just a product of the house. She was still connected to it. still tethered to Black Hollow like a marionette to a buried hand. Eleanor sat back, heart pounding. If Leela could dream of her, that meant there was still a thread, still a line between them. And threads, even cursed ones, can be pulled. She began testing it. Not with mirrors, not anymore. Those were too obvious, too easy for the thing inside them to manipulate. Instead, she began writing again, but backwards. In code, in memories layered between false ones. She started whispering to herself in the dark, not her name, but Leela's, every night. And one night, something whispered back, not in words, but in emotion, a sudden flash of disorientation. Far away, Leela was looking into a mirror and forgetting which side she belonged on. It was working. The thread was pulling taut. That day, Eleanor convinced the staff to let her write a letter to a friend as part of her recovery. She addressed it to Leela, knowing they would recognize the name from her sessions. The staff let her write it under supervision, assuming it was a coping mechanism. The letter was simple. You're walking through a house made of stolen names. I'm standing at the end of the hallway. You know which one. Come find me. She gave it to the nurse with a blank expression. 3 days later, she received a reply. No envelope. Just a slip of paper on her pillow, scrawled in her own handwriting, but sharper. Neater. More confident. I never should have looked in that mirror. That was the break. The thread between them snapped into place. Now she didn't need to wonder if Leela knew. She did, and she was cracking. Each night, Eleanor pressed deeper. She meditated, not to calm herself, but to sink. To recreate the feel of Black Hollow's corridors. To walk those halls again in her mind. To leave lights on in the rooms the house wanted to forget. And the dreams came back. Stronger. More vivid. One night, she found herself not in the hallway, but in a mirror, watching Leela. As Leela looked back, for the first time, it was her reflection that smiled first. Leela blinked, and her expression faltered. The house behind her, the real world, the outside, the freedom, dimmed just slightly. It was working. The reflection was bending. Eleanor leaned in close, pressed her hand to the glass, and said, I didn't fall. You pushed me. Leela stepped back, shook her head. No, you let go. The mirror fogged, split, cracked, but didn't shatter. They stared at each other through it. The air between them hums with old, unfinished things. And Eleanor whispered, you can keep my face. But the name, it was never yours to wear. That night, Leela Hart stopped appearing on the news. Her phone number disconnected. Her social accounts vanished. No trace. No sightings. The world began to forget her. But Eleanor, the nurses noticed a change. She began smiling again, but not too much. She began speaking in full sentences, but only when it mattered. And sometimes, when she passed the mirror on her way to the common room, she paused, just long enough, to remind the glass, you blink when I say you do. The thread was broken, but not lost, and now Eleanor had begun weaving a new one. This time, she wasn't being watched. She was watching. The silence didn't last. It never did. For a week, maybe 2, the world outside the glass pretended everything was normal again. Eleanor was given new clothes. Her sessions with the therapist grew shorter, and her name, her real name, began to reappear on her records. Even the staff said it with less hesitation now, as if something behind their eyes had let go of the script that labeled her as fractured. They smiled at her like they believed she could be whole, but Eleanor knew better, because the house hadn't been left behind. It had simply found a quieter way in. It started small, a moment of déjà vu when passing a hallway, a shiver down her spine when a door shut too slowly. Then came the dreams again, not violent, not even frightening at first, just familiar. She would find herself walking down old corridors. She would turn a corner and recognize the exact pattern of cracked tiles from the Black Hollow kitchen. The precise color of that scorched wallpaper in the study. She would wake to the scent of wet plaster and old paper, even though her window was open and the air outside smelled of rain and trees. It wasn't haunting her anymore. It was growing inside her, like a second spine, like a memory that refused to die. She began to draw again, not because anyone asked her to, but because her fingers needed something to hold. Charcoal on paper, just lines at first, then rooms. Windows that blinked, stairs that bent sideways. A door with no knob, marked by a shadow that lingered too long. The therapist noticed, of course. "This looks like the house you used to describe," he said during their next session, tapping one of her sketches. "It is the house," she said, voice flat. "But it's gone, Eleanor. You left it. You're safe now." She smiled, thinly, not unkindly. "No one ever leaves that house. Not really. It just follows you until you stop calling it a house." He didn't understand. Not yet. But he would. Because the house wasn't made of wood and stone. It was made of belief. And now, it had enough of her inside it to keep building, even here. Some nights, she'd hear footsteps in her room. Not loud. Just the soft scuff of bare soles on linoleum. Her shadow would flicker when she stood still, like it was adjusting to a different set of rules. And once, just once, she woke to find her bedsheets turned down with surgical precision, tucked just the way her mother used to do when Eleanor was 6. That same night, she found a key under her pillow. Small, blackened, cold. She didn't show it to anyone. She just kept it clenched in her palm, tucked beneath the skin of her silence. If the house wanted to come with her, fine. Let it see how it felt to be watched from this side. And that's when she made the decision. She wouldn't run from it anymore. She would build it back, on her terms, inside her. Not to trap herself, but to trap it. The next time she dreamt of Black Hollow, she didn't try to escape. She walked the halls with steady breath, eyes forward, no fear. The shadows leaned in, expecting her to flinch. She didn't. The whispers rose, speaking her name in all the wrong voices. She ignored them. At the end of the hallway, the door with no knob waited. She had the key now. She placed it into the flesh, like lock, turned, and opened the door. Inside was not darkness, it was a room of mirrors. Hundreds of them, each showing a different version of herself. Some younger, some older, some bleeding, some smiling with Leela's stolen confidence. All of them paused when she entered. They turned in unison and spoke one word: welcome. Eleanor stepped inside. And the mirrors didn't reflect anymore. They followed. Now she understood the final truth. She had never been trapped inside the house. The house had always been trapped inside her. It had mimicked her life, her fears, her voice, but it had no core of its own. No true shape. It only grew where belief allowed. And now she was the architect. The mirrors began to tremble. One cracked, then another, until all of them shattered. Not violently, but relieved, like glass finally released from the burden of false reflection. And in their place, walls, ceilings, stairs, a house forming from the wreckage, but not Black Hollow. This was something new, built on pain, yes, on memory, but also on defiance. She was giving it a shape that belonged to her. It wouldn't be safe. It wouldn't be pure. But it would be hers. Back in the waking world, Eleanor slept soundly for the first time in months. The nurses noticed the change, said she seemed lighter. But none of them asked about the new sketches on her wall. None of them noticed how the corners of her room seemed deeper now, as if they extended further than the space allowed. None of them felt the cold that seeped in after dark. But Eleanor did. She welcomed it. And in the middle of the night she whispered something into the shadows. "You took my name. I took your home. Let's see who lasts longer." The walls did not answer, but the light above her flickered once, as if the house had heard, as if it understood. The game wasn't over. It had just changed floors. The lights in her room began to hum. Not the tired buzz of aging fluorescent tubes, or the occasional flicker of unstable wiring. This was something deeper, fuller, like the bones of the building were vibrating in sympathy with something that had just awoken. Eleanor knew the sound well. It was the same frequency the house had once used to sing to her when she stood still too long near its stairwells. Back when Black Hollow still had a ceiling over her head and walls that pretended not to breathe. Now, it sang again. But it wasn't coming from Black Hollow this time. It was coming from underneath. Her hospital room hadn't changed in any noticeable way, not to anyone else. The same pale walls, the same furniture, all arranged just so. But that morning, when she slid her legs off the bed and stood, the floor felt different. It was warmer than it should have been, softer, like it recognized her. She stood in the center of the room, perfectly still, listening. The hum grew louder. And then, just beneath the heel of her foot, a subtle vibration. She knelt, pressed her ear to the floor, and heard it. A heartbeat, faint, steady, coming from below. That was the first sign. The second came later that day. During her routine walk with the occupational therapist, they passed the long hallway that led to the south wing, a wing under renovation, supposedly sealed for months. No patients, no staff, no lights. But the door at the end, it was open just slightly. As they walked by, Eleanor slowed, felt the pull, felt the invitation. The therapist didn't notice, but she did. The floor was calling her. That night, long after lights out, she left her bed, silent, barefoot, careful not to disturb the air too much. The hallway outside was quiet. The only sound the distant cough of a nurse somewhere down the hall. She walked toward the south wing, the door still cracked, waiting for her like an old friend. She stepped inside. Darkness swallowed her whole, and when the door shut behind her, it didn't make a sound. The air was cold, but not empty. Something was breathing again. No, listening. She felt her way down the corridor. The floor beneath her toes pulsed once, like a throat swallowing. She kept walking, guided by instinct, by memory, by the invisible tether that now bound her to whatever had been growing underneath her room. And then she found it. A stairwell. Not marked, not lit. A new one. It descended sharply, like a tunnel bored into the belly of the building. She took the first step, and it groaned. She took another. The hum returned. With every step downward, the sound grew richer. It wasn't mechanical. It was vocal, like 100 mouths humming through the walls, sensing their tones into one living resonance. The stairwell didn't feel like part of the hospital. The walls were no longer drywall. They were stone. Wet, ancient stone, covered in moss that glowed faintly under her fingers. She had entered a floor that didn't belong. Not to the building, not to the world, but to her. The moment she reached the bottom, a light bloomed ahead, pale blue, flickering. She moved toward it, and the hallway opened up into a room. It was empty, save for one thing. A mirror, not standing, not framed. Just a slab of glass embedded in the far wall. The room itself pulsed like a lung, exhaling shadows with each beat of the mirror's light. Eleanor approached, and the moment she stood in front of it, she knew what this place was. It was the unfinished floor, the space that hadn't been claimed yet, not by Black Hollow, not by her, but by something in between. She stared into the mirror. Her reflection looked back, tired, pale, unbroken, and then the image began to shift, not morph, split. The reflection became two. On one side, her, as she was now. On the other, Leela, polished, perfect. But this time, Leela looked afraid. She was no longer smiling. Her eyes flicked side to side, like she sensed something watching her from beyond the mirror. Eleanor raised her hand. So did both reflections. But only one held a key. Hers. The blackened key from beneath the pillow. The one that didn't match any lock in this world. She held it up, and the mirror cracked down the center. Leela screamed, but the sound was pulled away before it left her mouth. Like something in the mirror vacuumed the noise out of her throat. The crack spread. The light flickered. The room trembled. Eleanor stepped forward, and for the first time, the mirror didn't push back. It let her through, one step, then another. She wasn't walking into a reflection. She was walking through it. And on the other side, Another floor. Another room. Another version of the story. Not of the house, but of her. A hallway stretched ahead. Black Hollow's bones, but not its skin. She had rebuilt it here, in this buried floor of memory and possibility. And in the center of the hall, tied with red thread to the doorknobs on either end, stood a shape, a body, a figure wrapped in silence. It looked like Lila. But it no longer moved. Eleanor approached, reached up, and cut the thread with the edge of the key. The figure collapsed like an empty dress. No scream, no resistance. Just the end of something old. The room exhaled. The mirrors behind her went dark. And Eleanor whispered, "You weren't the first thing it wore, but you'll be the last." She stepped back through the glass, back into the hallway beneath the hospital, alone, but no longer haunted. She climbed the stairs slowly, feeling the house settle inside her chest, quieter now, obedient. She wasn't its prey anymore. She was its keeper. The floor that wasn't meant to exist had accepted her. And from here on out, she would decide what stories lived inside it. It started remembering the same night she sealed Lila's thread and watched her collapse like breath leaving a borrowed body. Eleanor had expected peace, maybe even stillness, but what she found instead was something far stranger: awareness. The room beneath the hospital, the one built in the fault line between this world and Black Hollow, began to shift. Not just in shape, but in thought. It didn't just echo anymore. It remembered. Things Eleanor had never told it, things she had long forgotten. It started speaking in memories. She returned to it the next night, drawn by a sensation too strong to resist. Not curiosity, no, that had long since burned out. This was instinct. It called to her like a forgotten lullaby hummed through old walls. As she stepped through the cracked stairwell and descended, she noticed something different. There were no mirrors now, no reflections, only paintings, hundreds of them, lining the corridor down. Each frame carved in bone, white wood, each canvas a perfect moment from her past. Her mother brushing her hair near a fogged-up window. Her father sitting at the edge of her bed, eyes hollow with grief. The first time she lied about being okay. The night she kissed someone and tasted loneliness on their lips. She paused in front of one that hadn't existed in memory until now, Black Hollow, before it had ever been haunted, a normal house, ordinary in its charm, a birthday cake glowing on a kitchen counter, a smiling girl with dark hair and bare feet. The name on the photo's label, Lila, not Eleanor, Lila. The blood in her hands turned to static. So that was it. The house hadn't just copied her, it had chosen her based on something older. A resemblance, a pattern. It had once worn Lila, long before it wore Eleanor. Maybe every version of it had found a girl like her, and once it used them up, it moved on to the next, weaving the same story again and again with different threads, different names, but the same shape, the same mirrors, the same smile. This wasn't just a haunting. This was a pattern of consumption. Eleanor reached out and touched the painting. The canvas felt warm, and beneath her fingertips, the image moved, slowly, subtly. Lila's head turned toward her in the portrait. Her mouth moved. "I didn't survive," she whispered. "I stayed." Eleanor pulled her hand back, the breath ripped from her chest. The hallway pulsed. The paintings weren't art, they were prisons. Snapshots of every soul the house had ever worn. She kept walking, each step heavier than the last. At the bottom of the corridor, the room awaited. This time it had furniture. A fireplace flickered gently, a table, a mirror, a single armchair, items Eleanor had once owned but hadn't thought of in years. Childhood things, an old stuffed rabbit, a cracked snow globe with a frozen carousel. The house had gathered her, pieced her together like a memory it didn't want to lose. And on the wall opposite her, a door, simple, ordinary, but it radiated something Eleanor recognized immediately: finality. This was the last room. The heart of whatever Black Hollow had become inside her. She moved toward it, the wooden floor beneath her creaking softly, not in warning, but in recognition. This was her home now, and it wanted her to choose. Open the door and forget, or turn back and remember. Because the house didn't just take people, it rewrote them. To open that door meant losing the weight, the pain, the story, all of it. Leela had done it once, so had the others. They had walked through, become softer versions of themselves, easier for the world to digest. Eleanor could feel the offer rise like warmth in her throat, a life without grief, without questions. Just peace. A new name, a smiling face. She could walk upstairs, and everyone would love her. Everyone would trust her. No one would ask what she'd seen. And in exchange, she'd simply forget. She reached for the doorknob and stopped, because she heard a laugh, faint, from inside the room, her laugh. But younger, and then, another sound, a crying child. Not her voice, not a memory, something alive. The house hadn't just built itself on pain. It was feeding on the fragments of forgotten people. And somewhere, a piece of someone, maybe even a child, was still inside. Trapped, waiting. She stepped back. Her choice was made. She would not forget. She would not let the house unmake her. Instead, she turned to the fireplace, grabbed the metal poker, and drove it into the floor. The house screamed, not in sound, but in sensation. The walls trembled. The paintings howled in silence. The door turned black, bleeding shadow around its frame. But Eleanor didn't stop. She stabbed again, and with each strike, memories flared behind her eyes. Names, rooms, children, Lila, others. A multitude of borrowed skins. And then, finally, a crack appeared in the wall. A real crack, no metaphor, no trick. The house shuddered. And for the first time since she'd been dragged into its story, Eleanor saw fear. Not hers. The fire roared, then died. The door swung open on its own, revealing nothing but ash. The room darkened. But she stood in it, unshaken, and whispered, "You only win when I forget. And I never will." As she walked back up the staircase, the hum followed her. Fainter now, more hesitant. Because the house understood something it hadn't expected. Eleanor wasn't its victim anymore. She was its historian, and it could never silence the ones who remembered. The world outside the hidden room didn't welcome her return with sunlight or applause. It didn't even notice. Eleanor stepped through the cracked stairwell and back into the hospital like a ghost re-entering her own skin. The hallway was still dim. The clocks still blinked their unchanging time. A nurse walked past her without so much as a glance. To them, she had never left. To them, she was still Eleanor Blake, the quiet girl recovering from some trauma they couldn't quite name. But Eleanor knew better now. She hadn't been recovering. She had been waking up. Her shoes left faint marks on the tile as she walked back to her room, the weight of soot and shattered memories clinging to her like a second skin. The door creaked when she opened it, and for a second, she thought it would resist. That the house's shadow would snap it back, lock her out, punish her for what she'd done. But it didn't. It let her in. The key she had hidden beneath her mattress, blackened, rusted, was gone. No trace of it, no warmth left in the sheets. Just the faint scent of smoke, like something had burned in her absence. She sat on the bed, not tired, not dazed, but aware. She reached under her pillow, half expecting another letter, another taunt in her own handwriting. But there was nothing. The thread between her and Leela was truly severed now, not just cut, but burned. And what remained wasn't silence, it was opportunity. The house, broken as it was, had never been destroyed. It had simply been emptied. And what do you do with an empty house? You rebuild it, not to invite others in, but to trap the thing that used to call it home. For weeks, Eleanor played her part. She met with therapists, ate her meals, answered questions. She smiled when she had to, slept with one eye open, and all the while, beneath her calm surface, she was planning. She'd seen what the house truly was now. Not a location, not a spirit, not even a cursed object. It was a system, a pattern, a hungry, Ritualistic cycle designed to feed on people who didn't fit neatly in their own lives. People like her, people like Leela. The broken, the silenced, the forgotten. And now that she knew its shape, she could break it in places that mattered. Her dreams became quieter. Not empty, but organized. She'd walk through the corridors at night and draw blueprints in her mind. Walls that didn't reflect, windows that looked out instead of in, doors that opened only for those who knew they were inside something false. It was no longer Black Hollow. That house had collapsed under its own cruelty. This was something new, a sanctuary of confusion, a trap for traps. She started with her drawings. Not just idle sketches this time, but full schematics. She drew the floor plan of the floor beneath the hospital, line by line. Every twist and turn she remembered from the night she confronted the mirror. She added layers. Subfloors, secret panels, staircases that turned in on themselves. A whole maze designed not to contain her, but to contain it, because she felt it, even now, still breathing somewhere just outside her reach. Weaker now, slower, yes, but not gone. It had fled her, like a wound that didn't know how to close. And wounds left unattended, they rot. She started asking the other patients questions in careful ways. Do you ever feel like your room changes at night? Ever see something in the mirror that doesn't move quite right? Do your dreams have stairs? Most shook their heads, gave polite smiles, walked away faster. But one, an older woman named Delia, nodded once and whispered, "It wears my sister's face." That was all Eleanor needed to hear. The house wasn't just in her anymore. It was trying again. Reaching, hoping someone else would walk through the wrong door, look into the wrong glass. Forget their own face long enough to be replaced. Eleanor wouldn't let that happen. She began leaving drawings behind, quietly, folded in the creases of common room books, slipped under cafeteria trays, scratched into the backs of playing cards. Each one a fragment of the blueprint. Each one designed to awaken something in whoever found it. She didn't care if most were ignored. She just needed one other person to see it, to believe, to open their eyes. Because belief, she'd learned, wasn't just how the house spread, it was how it broke. She made her final piece during a thunderstorm. The rain pounded the windows, and for a moment, the sound of it was almost enough to drown out the hum beneath the floor. She took a blank canvas from the art therapy room and painted. Not a scene, not a person, but a blueprint of escape. A map not to freedom, but to awareness. The angles were sharp, the doors warped, the stairs wrong. It looked like nonsense to anyone else. But if someone looked long enough, it would show them. She left it hanging in the hallway outside the south wing, right where the hidden stairwell used to be. And when she returned the next morning, it was gone. No one had taken it down. It had simply vanished, like the house had eaten it, or maybe someone else had seen it and taken it with them. That night, Eleanor dreamed of footsteps that weren't hers walking down stairs that shouldn't exist. She smiled. It had begun again. But this time, not as prey, not as a name to be erased. She was the architect now, and the house wouldn't know the difference. Not until it was already trapped inside a design it couldn't escape, just like all the others. And when it finally asked, "Where am I?" she would smile back, teeth sharp, and whisper, "Inside me." Because she was no longer just a survivor. She was the echo, the answer. The last reflection the house would ever see. There are things a building should never say. Not out loud. Not in the middle of the night when everyone else is sleeping and the hallways are supposed to be still. But Eleanor heard it, clear as breath against her ear, muffled only by the thin plaster of her room's far wall. A whisper that wasn't hers. A voice not meant for speech. It didn't form words at first, just murmurs, syllables crawling over each other like roots. But then it tried again, tried harder, and this time it spoke in a voice that stopped her heart. "You shouldn't have taught it your name." She turned slowly. The wall behind her bed was blank, unadorned, same as it always had been. But the air was heavier now, like something had grown lungs in the paint. She didn't move. She didn't need to. The message wasn't a threat. It was a confirmation. Proof. Something was watching. Not from behind the mirror anymore. From within the structure itself. The house was learning. That was the cost of fighting something made of thought. When you tried to outsmart it, when you gave it rules to break, it didn't get weaker. It got smarter. It began to imitate you. It had learned from her silence, from her defiance, from the way she had weaponized memory and space in twisted corridors, and now it wanted to build its own trap again. Not through reflections or dreams this time, but through architecture. It started subtly, a vent cover gone, a screw fallen from the ceiling without sound. Eleanor would pass a hallway she'd walked 100 times, only to find it longer by several steps. Once, the corner outside the rec room bent at a perfect 90-degree angle one morning. But by evening, it curved instead, swallowing half the vending machine that used to sit there. The staff didn't notice. They couldn't. The house wasn't bending their reality. It was rewriting hers, which meant it hadn't given up. It was building again. And she was still the blueprint. She needed help, but not from the outside. Therapists wouldn't understand. Nurses would nod, medicate, and steer the conversation away from delusions. No, she needed someone within. Someone who'd already heard the house whisper once. Someone like Delia. She found her in the sunroom the next morning, sitting quietly, a crossword folded in her lap. The older woman's eyes were tired but sharp, the kind that knew how to pretend sleep better than they knew how to chase it. Eleanor didn't waste time. "They're changing the hallways," she said. Delia didn't flinch. She simply turned her head slightly, like a cat deciding whether or not a sound was real. "You saw the door, didn't you?" Eleanor continued. "The one that shouldn't be here. The one they built around instead of through." Delia's fingers twitched against the paper. "I've seen more than the door," she said quietly. "I've seen what's behind it, or what used to be." Eleanor sat beside her. "We have to stop it before it finds someone new. It doesn't need a name. It just needs someone to forget their own." Delia's voice was a whisper again. "Then you better remember yours." That night, the wall behind Eleanor's bed bled. It didn't leak liquid or drip rot. It bled shapes. Long, curling veins of black paint began to stretch from the baseboard upward, forming spidery cracks that didn't exist in any blueprint. They wove themselves into the outline of a door. A door with no knob, no hinges, just presence. It throbbed softly with the pulse of something impatient. Eleanor didn't touch it. Instead, she drew it. She mapped every curl, every angle, every swirl of distortion that formed as the house tried to force itself through the wall. And when she finished, she folded the paper and left it under Delia's pillow. By morning, the drawing was gone, and the door on the wall had faded. Not vanished, just paused, like it was watching now, waiting to see what she would do next. But she had already begun, because the house had made a mistake. It had tried to rewrite her again, tried to pull her back into the role of lost, wandering girl, afraid of her own thoughts. But Eleanor was no longer afraid. She had stepped into its script once, and she had revised it. Now, she was writing new rules. Every wall it twisted, she sketched. Every door it created, she copied and warped. Every hallway that grew too long, she mapped and shortened with lines of chalk she stole from group therapy. She wasn't just defending anymore. She was building a counter, structure inside the house's mutation. A mental floor plan wrapped around the original. A labyrinth of willpower. And Delia. She had joined in. Every night, they met in the hallway between their rooms, stood in silence, holding their new blueprints like weapons. Delia carved messages into the walls with a sharpened spoon. Eleanor whispered names into the air, old names the house had once swallowed, and together, they began the undoing. It didn't go quietly. The ceiling cracked once above Eleanor's bed and dropped a dead bird onto her blanket. One that wasn't native to this area. One that had no eyes, but was still breathing when she touched it. The walls screamed once, not with sound but with emotion. A sudden flood of grief so strong it nearly sent her collapsing to her knees. And mirrors, which she had sworn off for weeks, began reappearing. No longer reflective, just dark. Pools of shadow that showed nothing. Not her, not the room. Just absence. The house was fighting back. But now, for the first time, it was fighting with its back against the wall, because Eleanor had become something it had never prepared for. Not an intruder, not a puppet, but a rival. A builder. She didn't want to burn it down. No, she wanted to trap it inside its own design. She wanted it to feel what it had made her feel. Forgotten. Boxed in. Observed by something that refused to explain itself. And once it did, once the last hallway looped into itself, and the final door led nowhere. Then, maybe then, she'd finally open the final room again. The one with the fireplace. The one that remembered everything. And when she did, the house would meet the only version of her it had never anticipated. The one who had learned how to build fear better than it ever could. The walls began whispering in circles. It started as a sound Eleanor couldn't quite place, like static trapped inside an empty cup. It followed her everywhere, in the cafeteria, in the shower, during group therapy, when everyone else spoke in half-truths and numbed words. It wasn't language, not at first. Just the low scrape of something trying to become clear. She'd been through this before. The murmurs, the illusions, the manipulation. But this time it wasn't trying to scare her. It was trying to talk. And not to confuse her. To convince her. At 2:13 a.m., when the hallway lights dimmed too much and the shadows grew just a little too confident, she finally understood the message. Let me out. Not a threat. A plea. It should have terrified her. Instead, it made her smile. Because for the first time, the house was begging. It was no longer the confident puppeteer behind the mirrors. It had slipped, made itself visible, and worse, it had become contained. All her blueprints, her chalk lines, her whispered names, her theft of space, it had worked. She had built a shell around it. The labyrinth was no longer just in her head. It existed now, wrapped around this building like a second skin. A nervous system of trapdoors, dead ends, and name, anchored fail-safes. But like anything cornered, the house grew hungry. Eleanor began losing time again, but only for seconds, a blink too long. A word she didn't remember saying, a door she hadn't closed now slightly ajar. Once, she opened her closet and found a pair of shoes that weren't hers, men's shoes, black leather. Worn, but polished. She didn't touch them, because she knew who had worn them. She'd seen those shoes once, worn by the man who'd brought the original Leela to Black Hollow all those years ago. The real Leela. Not the mimic that replaced Eleanor. The shoes weren't just a memory. They were an invitation. The house wanted her to come back in, not as its enemy, but as its vessel. It didn't want to fight anymore. It wanted to live again. To use her voice, her face, her mind. Because it had learned the truth, Eleanor was better at surviving than any of the others. And it wanted that kind of permanence. She responded the only way she could, by deepening the trap. She spent her days making small talk with the staff, pretending to improve. But at night, she and Delia worked like architects of a prison only they could see. Delia, for her part, had begun to remember. Not just her sister's face, but the things the house had taken from her. The soft moments, her handwriting, her ability to hum in tune. It had gnawed those pieces off her soul, left her lopsided, incomplete. But Eleanor had shown her how to reclaim them. Every time they rebuilt a hallway in the labyrinth, whispering to the walls, sketching over old floor plans, they took something back, and the house began to rot. Not visibly, but structurally. The rules it once obeyed started to collapse, reflections delayed by a second. doors refusing to stay shut, even the shadows confused. They jittered, shivered, split into fragments that darted into corners, never quite recombining. And then one night, Eleanor found the center. It wasn't a room, it was a hole. Behind the south wing, past a wall that hadn't been there 2 days ago, she found a door that whispered when she touched it. Not in words, but in a tone that she recognized. It was her own voice, saying things she had never said aloud. I want it to love me. I never asked to survive. I miss the person I was before I learned to lie so well. She opened the door. Inside was darkness. Not pitch black, but thick, like molasses, like ink with bones. And at the center of the room, a mouth. Not attached to a face, not growing from a body, just a gaping mouth, wet, breathing, huge. It pulsed with slow, rhythmic gasps, sucking in air it would never use. Above it, suspended like a broken marionette, hung the fractured form of Leela. Half smile, eyes shut, limbs limp, as if the strings had just been cut. The house had stored her here, the echo of its favorite skin. Not to preserve her, but to remember how it felt to wear her. And now, it wanted Eleanor to take her place. She stepped closer to the mouth. It breathed deeper. She felt its pull, not physical, but psychological. Emotional, like it was trying to draw her secrets out through her skin. Feed on them before she could even remember what they were. I'm not yours, she said. The mouth didn't react. It just opened wider, revealing teeth made of keys, dozens, hundreds. Each one a name, a voice, a memory, stolen, swallowed, gone. She took one step closer. The air was hot now, smelled like wilted lilies and old hair. She crouched, slowly, and whispered, "You want to be real so badly." The mouth trembled. What but real things die? And with that, she reached into her pocket and pulled out the last piece of chalk, worn thin, almost broken, and drew a door around the mouth. A perfect rectangle. But this time, she didn't open it. She sealed it shut. With a symbol no one remembered anymore. A sigil Eleanor had pieced together through weeks of listening to walls, reading the lines behind her own dreams, and translating the hum of haunted lights. As she finished the last stroke, the mouth screamed. No sound, but the room imploded, pulled in on itself like lungs that had forgotten how to expand. The air popped, and the mouth, with all its teeth, vanished into the walls, taking Leela with it, taking all of them. When Eleanor woke, she was on the floor of the rec room, surrounded by staff, a nurse calling her name, Delia nearby, hand trembling in hers. There was no door to the south wing anymore, no hallway, no paintings, just a blank wall, and the humming, gone, not silent, just gone. The house had lost its center, and without its mouth, it couldn't feed. Eleanor looked up at the white ceiling, blinking slowly. For the first time since she had met the mirror, she felt no pull, no pressure, no threat. And in the absence of those things, a question formed. Not what now, but who am I now that the house has no voice left to steal? And that, she knew, would be the hardest answer of all. The silence didn't feel like peace. It felt like a missing scream, an absence that ached in the air, like the hush after a fire dies out, but before anyone dares breathe again. Eleanor had stripped the house of its mouth, sealed its hunger into the very walls that once whispered her name. But the silence that followed wasn't grateful. It was waiting, and she could feel it everywhere. In the way her room no longer settled with night noises, in the way the nurses paused just a moment too long before speaking to her, in the way mirrors had stopped working altogether. No reflection, no shimmer, just glass that looked like it belonged to someone else's world entirely. She didn't speak much in the days after. Words felt cheap, like they didn't belong in her mouth anymore. The only sound she trusted was the faint scratch of pencil on paper as she filled notebook after notebook with blueprints. Not of the labyrinth, not of the trap, but of herself, of the parts that had been stolen and replaced. She mapped her fears like rooms, her memories like windows, her hope, thin and trembling, like a door without hinges. And at the center of all of it, a question that refused to die. If the house was gone, why did she still feel watched? Delia noticed first. She came to Eleanor one morning with a look in her eyes that Eleanor had never seen before. Not fear, but awareness. It's not whispering anymore, Delia said softly, but something still listening. That was the moment Eleanor realized the mistake. She had focused so hard on sealing the mouth, on crushing the center, on silencing the scream, that she had never thought about the ears. The house hadn't just consumed, it had learned. And while its hunger had been sealed, its ability to hear had been left wide open. It knew what Eleanor knew. It had watched her build every trap, sketch every map, forge every wall of memory. And now it was using that knowledge to build something else. The staff began acting strange, not suddenly, not in dramatic ways, but small changes, too small to dismiss. Their smiles lingered too long. Their movements became unnervingly smooth, like they were acting from muscle memory that hadn't been earned. They started calling Eleanor Miss Hollow, not as a joke, not as a slip, but with a strange reverence, like the name belonged to her now. One night she passed Dr. Creel, the only psychiatrist who'd ever taken her seriously, and he didn't look at her, just stared through her, and muttered, "Blueprints." She wrote the blueprint. She didn't sleep that night. Instead, she waited. And just before dawn, her room door creaked open on its own. But no one entered. She got out of bed and crossed to the door, only to find a trail of small white pebbles leading down the hall. Not stones, teeth. Baby teeth. Human. Perfectly clean, perfectly lined, leading toward the janitor's stairwell that had been sealed off since the last renovation. She followed them. Not out of curiosity, but out of dread, because if the house no longer had a voice, it would need a new one. A new face. A new body. It would need to be reborn. And she was its midwife. The stairwell door groaned when she touched it, bleeding rust around the handle like it didn't want to be touched. But it opened. Inside darkness. But not complete. A single bare bulb swung from the ceiling, illuminating a stairway that spiraled down. She'd never seen this stairwell before. It shouldn't have existed. But the teeth kept going. Each step down pulsed with warmth beneath her bare feet. Like blood, like breath, the house hadn't died. It had nested. At the bottom, she found it. A room, round and soft, like the inside of a lung. Walls fleshy and pulsing. And in the center, a crib. White wood, cracked and dusty. Empty. Until she blinked. And then it wasn't. There was a baby inside. But not a baby. Its body was small, yes, wrapped in thin gray cloth like burial gauze. But its head was wrong. Too large. Too aware. It didn't cry. It watched her. Eyes black and infinite. Its mouth still forming. Little more than a slit, sealed with wire, like it had been kept quiet long enough. But it was trying. She stepped closer. And from the shadows around the room, she saw movement. Shapes of people. Former patients. Former versions of her. All watching. All silent. Waiting for her to do what they never could. Finish the rebirth. Give it a name. Let it begin again. She stared down at the crib and whispered, "You don't get to be born." The baby blinked slowly. The wires on its lips rattled. And then, deliberately, it smiled. Not with its mouth, but with the shapes forming beneath its skin. She stepped back, turned to run. But the walls closed in behind her, flesh sealing the doorway shut. The room pulsed. And for the first time in her life, Eleanor screamed. Not out of fear, but fury. "You don't get to wear me again!" She turned back to the crib and pulled the last item from her pocket. A needle she'd stolen from the nurse's cart. Not for violence, but for writing. She stepped to the wall and carved, "Deep and slow I rum'em-br." The room howled. The baby's smile collapsed. The shadows screamed, and the walls began to bleed names. So many names. Names the house had swallowed, erased, forgotten. But not anymore. She said them aloud, one by one. Delia's sister, the boy from 4C who stopped speaking 3 years ago, Lila. Her own. With each name, the room shook. The crib splintered. and the child inside began to age, rapidly, rotting, peeling, until it wasn't a child anymore. Just the remains of a lie trying too hard to become real. Eleanor dropped the needle. The walls opened. Let her out. She didn't look back. Didn't need to. Because the house still had ears. But now it also had truth. And truth, she'd learned, is the only thing louder than silence. She walked back to her room and slept. And for the first time in years, she dreamed of nothing. It began with the flowers. The kind they kept in small vases on the nurse's desk. Cheap, synthetic blooms made to resemble life without ever having lived. For weeks they had always been there, part of the hospital's illusion of care, sterile kindness propped up on a stem. But that morning, they were gone, not removed, not replaced, just absent. The vase was there, empty, dry, as if it had never held anything at all, Eleanor noticed. And she knew right then, the house was losing details. Small ones, but important, because details are what make something real. And the house, stripped of its hunger and now robbed of its name, was beginning to slip. She tested it by walking past Nurse Hadley, the one who always offered her that hollow "doing okay today" smile. Hadley glanced up, expression soft, but her eyes didn't light with recognition, didn't even squint. Eleanor paused, waited. Nothing. She took another step, then said "morning." The nurse nodded, but not to her. Just a reflex. A tick, as if responding to motion rather than memory. The walls had started forgetting her, exactly as she had hoped. Her trap hadn't just closed around the house's voice. It had turned the house's memory inward, fracturing it. Each night, Eleanor had fed it names, anchored pieces of lost people back into the space it claimed. And now, that memory map was unraveling the architecture of the thing itself. The house didn't just feed on the broken. It stored them. And like any storage too full and too fragile, it had started to collapse. But with collapse came danger. Because even a dying thing can still lash out. It began corrupting space, desperately, like a panicked animal chewing through its own leg. Doors shifted position, windows blinked in and out of walls, floor tiles rearranged while no one was watching. Eleanor opened her bathroom cabinet one morning and found her own eye staring back at her. Not in a mirror, but as if someone else was looking through from the other side. She closed it without flinching, because that was all it had left now. Scare tactics, empty mimicry. But mimicry wasn't memory, and that made her stronger. Delia, however, had begun to forget things too, only not in the harmless way. She began repeating questions, asking the same names twice. "Did you see my sister?" she asked one morning. "You told me she was gone," Eleanor answered gently. Delia blinked. "Did I?" She sat back, eyes glossy. The house had started feeding again, not fully, but desperately. Not on grief this time. On certainty. Eleanor realized too late. When she had pulled the house inward, she had opened a new wound. Not for herself, but for the others. It couldn't bite her anymore, but it could gnaw at the people around her, especially the ones who believed. And Delia, poor Delia, believed too much. That night, Eleanor heard a knock on her door. 3 short taps. She opened it without hesitation, but the hallway was empty, except for a trail of yellow crayons leading toward the long, abandoned north wing. Delia's crayons. She followed them. Not because she wanted to, because she had to. The north wing had always been blocked off. Warped floorboards, peeled paint, a persistent mildew smell no one seemed able to scrub out. But tonight, it looked new. Fresh walls, polished handles, the illusion of renovation. She stepped inside. Immediately, the air grew thick, heavy, like breath had been suspended in it. At the end of the corridor, a door swung slowly, and behind it, Delia. But not quite. She sat in a rocking chair, humming, the same lullaby from before. Only, her mouth wasn't moving. The sound came from the walls. She turned, slowly, smiled. "Eleanor," she said. "You forgot my name." "No," Eleanor said carefully. "You forgot yours." Delia shook her head. "It took it. You gave yours back, and it needed another." I didn't know what else to give. Behind her, the wallpaper began to ripple. Eleanor stepped closer and noticed the walls weren't paper at all. They were skin, stretched thin and veined, like old parchment, and in the grooves, names. Scratched in with nails, in every direction, layered like scabs on scabs. Each one was crossed out, except one. Delia. She reached out to touch it, and the wall flinched, not metaphorically. It jerked away, a spasming thing recoiling from its own label. I'm going to take it back, Eleanor whispered. You can't, Delia said, her voice small now. It only gives names when something else is taken. That's how it survives. Eleanor looked around. This wasn't a wing. It was a memory vault. A feeding chamber. For every patient who'd walked in with a broken identity. The house hadn't forgotten Eleanor because it lost interest. It had done so because it was trading her for new ones. Delia was the first. There would be more. Unless Eleanor sealed this place too. She stepped forward, pulled out a mirror fragment she'd carried since the labyrinth's collapse. Held it to the wall. The names screamed. The wall began to split, tearing like wet paper. Delia screamed too, falling from the chair, clutching her head. The lullaby stuttered. Eleanor didn't stop. She pressed the shard against the name. Hard, and whispered, "You don't get to keep what you don't remember." The wall burst, not into pieces, into faces, hundreds of them, all flickering, all screaming, all shattering. The mirror shard dissolved in her hand. The wall peeled back, and the north wing was empty again. No chair, no names, no Delia. Eleanor turned, and found herself standing back in her own room. Alone. The door closed gently behind her, as if it had never been open. She sank onto the bed, heart pounding. It was close now. The house wasn't dead. It was cornered, and a cornered thing always fights hardest at the end. She reached for her notebook, and this time she didn't draw blueprints. She wrote a name. The one the house feared most, its own. Because if she could make it remember itself, not as a place, not as a trap, but as a lie given shape, she could finally finish this story. Not with fire, not with escape, but with erasure. The name came to her in a dream that wasn't hers. That's how she knew it was real. Eleanor had long since stopped trusting the images that passed through her mind at night. Too often they were stitched together from someone else's memory, a mosaic of grief and mimicry meant to guide her back into the maze. But this dream, it felt older. Not colder, not cruel, just old, like stone covered in moss. In it, she stood on a shoreline that had no water. Just sand, miles of it. And on the horizon was a house, not Black Hollow, not the hospital, but something before them both. Primitive, half buried, carved from what looked like bone. No windows, just a single door. And above it, etched in a language she couldn't speak, but somehow understood, was the name. Not her name, its name. Velmir. It rang in her chest like a tuning fork. Sour and sharp, as if something inside her had heard it and remembered being afraid. She awoke gasping. And for the first time in days, she could hear the house again. Only it wasn't whispering. It was weeping. It had taken so much. Her memories, her voice, her certainty. But now it wanted mercy. She wouldn't give it that. Velmir. She said it aloud the moment she could breathe again, letting the word cut through the stale air of her room. The light bulb above her flickered so violently she thought it might explode. The walls shuddered, but not in resistance. In recognition. The name was the key, the thread running through every version of the house. Every echo of Black Hollow, every shifting hallway, every stolen soul. It was the root. And like any root, it needed to be dug out. She spent the day in silence, watching, measuring, waiting. And when night fell, Eleanor dressed not for battle, but for burial. She wrapped herself in her oldest clothes, carried no bag, no chalk, no tools. Just one single page torn from her notebook, the name scrawled across it in thick, bleeding ink, Velmir. The hospital was asleep when she slipped past the nurse's station. No one looked up, no one moved. They were breathing, yes, but not living. The house had frozen them in place. A defense mechanism. She was getting too close. Down the west hall, a stairwell she had never seen before now yawned open. She descended, each step echoing not with sound, but with memory. The air grew damp, thick, familiar. The same pressure she had felt that night in the mirror room. The same pull. At the bottom, a door. Not made of wood or metal, made of names. Layered, carved, etched, burned. All the ones the house had stolen. All the ones she had tried to give back. They were the door now. One name missing from the center. She approached, held out the paper. As the ink touched the door, it sank into the surface like blood absorbed by skin. The names quivered. The door began to open, not outward, not inward, but sideways, folding itself into reality like a seam being pulled apart. Inside was nothing, and then everything. A vast room of walls made from mirrors, each one cracked, shattered, but still standing, and in the center, a throne made of glass. On it no one. But as Eleanor stepped forward, the glass began to twist, and slowly, piece by piece, Velmure assembled itself, not into a man, not into a monster, but into a copy of her. Her face, her hands, her voice, but not her, because the eyes were all wrong. Velmure smiled with her mouth and said, "You look well." She stepped closer, pulse steady. "You look terrified." It chuckled. "I always knew you'd find it. The name? The true one. But I hoped you'd understand by then that it wasn't meant to be used." Eleanor tilted her head. "You're afraid of it." "Not afraid," Velmure said, standing, just disappointed. "We could have been something together. You gave me form. Gave me structure. I learned so much wearing your skin." "But you forgot one thing," Eleanor whispered. Velmure's smile faded. "What's that?" "I never stopped remembering who I was." She stepped forward, pulled the final mirror shard from her pocket, one she had kept hidden from even herself. It wasn't for reflection. It was for removal. She held it up, let Velmure see itself fully, and it screamed, because the mirrors weren't broken. They were wounds. Each one a scar left by someone who had resisted. Each one a reflection it couldn't fully consume. The glass throne cracked beneath it. The walls shivered. Velmure lunged. Eleanor raised the shard and named it. Velmure. That was all it took. The name, spoken in full awareness, with full memory, burned it. Stripped it down to a whimpering shape, a mass of light and shadow caught between realities. The room collapsed around them. But she didn't run. She watched. As Velmure began to dissolve, first the limbs, then the voice, then the smile it had stolen, it looked at her one last time, and asked, "If I disappear, who will remember you?" She answered without blinking, "I will." Then everything went white, not from light, but from absence, like the house had exhaled for the last time, and in that breath let go of everything. When Eleanor awoke, she was outside, on the hospital lawn, early morning, no sirens, no screams, just grass beneath her fingers, and silence that felt clean. She stood slowly and looked back. The hospital stood as it always had, but the wing where the house had nested was gone. Vanished. In its place, air. Nothing had been built there. Nothing had ever stood there, because without its name, without its shape, Velmure could no longer exist. Not in walls, not in mirrors, not in memory. She had erased it. Not with rage, not with destruction, but with the most powerful tool the house had once stolen, her identity. And now, she had it back, fully, finally. Her name was Eleanor Blake, and she remembered everything. It should have ended there, with the name erased, with Velmure dissolved into absence, with Eleanor standing in the soft quiet of morning, breathing air that felt clean for the first time in her life. But endings are liars. They present themselves like full stops, sharp, decisive, finite, when in truth they're doorways in disguise. Eleanor stood on that lawn, blinking in the daylight that didn't sting her skin, and knew something wasn't done. The house was gone, yes, but its echo wasn't, because she could still feel it, not around her, but inside, not as a haunting, but as a hollow. The hospital let her leave a week later. They said her tests came back fine, that her progress was nothing short of remarkable. Her therapist smiled too brightly, her nurses offered farewells they didn't seem to believe in. Eleanor packed a single bag, just clothes. No drawings, no tokens. She left behind the notebooks, the mirror shards, the keys she'd once kept hidden beneath the floorboards. She told herself she didn't need them anymore, that they belonged to the girl she used to be. But she couldn't bring herself to throw them out either. She simply left them. Like the bones of a snake that no longer needed its old skin. Outside, the world moved as if nothing had ever happened. Children played, cars honked, strangers laughed into phones and cursed at traffic. But Eleanor moved through it like a ghost wearing flesh, untethered, unnoticed, unreal. She rented a small studio on the edge of town, far from the hospital, far from the woods. The walls were blank, the air sterile, the kind of place that had never known secrets. She slept on a mattress on the floor, no mirror, no windows that faced east. And every night, she lit a candle and sat in silence, waiting for something she couldn't name. She never dreamed. Not anymore. But that was the problem. The silence had grown too clean, too perfect, like a body that had stopped breathing long ago. It started small, as it always did. A radio crackling to life without power. A door she knew she locked swinging open just enough to whisper welcome. She dismissed the signs at first, told herself this wasn't the house. Couldn't be. Velmer was gone. She had said its name, burned it, buried it. But something kept slipping through, not Velmer. Something older. A question that had been forming since the very beginning. If the house had fed on the broken, then what had created the house? Who had first called it forth? Who had shaped its original name? She went back to her sketches. Unwillingly at first. Her hands trembled when she touched the pencil, but the moment graphite met paper, the images came pouring out. Not the maze, not the throne, but a room she had never seen, yet somehow always remembered. Stone walls, no ceiling, a floor covered in sand that shifted when you breathed. At the center, a circle of figures, each hooded, faceless, standing in silence around something half buried in the ground. A name, not written, but alive, and they were speaking it, over and over, not summoning, not worshipping, but planting. She dropped the pencil. The sketch fluttered to the ground, the sand she had drawn seeming to scatter across the page like real grains. And for the first time in months, Eleanor felt fear, because she understood now. Velmer hadn't been the beginning, it had been the first bloom. The house wasn't a predator. It was a fruit, born from something deeper, something seeded long before Eleanor's name ever meant anything at all. The echo hadn't stopped. It had only gone deeper. It wanted her to follow. So she did. Not back to the hospital. That place was dust now, a carcass of brick and drywall. She followed the sketches instead. Each night she drew, and each drawing brought her closer. A cave under a forgotten church. A garden of windows. Each reflecting a version of herself she'd never been. A mouth carved into a well that only whispered when the moon was full. Every sketch felt like memory. Every step forward felt like returning. She traveled for days, then weeks, hitchhiked, slept in buses, ate what she could afford, until, finally, she found it. An abandoned house on the edge of a cliff. Not Black Hollow, older, rotten timber. A foundation made of stone so old it had no origin. It hadn't been built. It had been placed. Eleanor stood before it, heart hollow, soul silent, and stepped inside. It didn't breathe, didn't whisper, didn't threaten. It watched. The walls were warm, too warm, like skin pulled over bone. And in the center of the house, no furniture, no staircase, just a circle of salt, and a mirror, no reflection, just darkness. And within that darkness, something moved, not toward her, but in place, spinning, turning, forming. It didn't speak, it didn't need to, because Eleanor finally understood. Velmer had been an echo, but this was the source, the unspoken thing, the idea of the house, the first hunger, and she had come here not to destroy it, but to ask it one question, the only question that had ever truly mattered. Why me? The mirror pulsed, and the answer came not in sound, but in recognition. She had never been chosen, she had been grown. Raised in soil the house had prepared. Every loss, every silence, every betrayal, each one a drop of water on a seed buried so deep she never saw it take root. She hadn't escaped the house, she had become its heir. And now, it was hers. If she took it, if she named it again, she could shape it. Not as a place of torment, but of judgment, a new blueprint, a new order. She stepped into the circle of salt, and the mirror's surface began to ripple, not with her face, but with the faces of every soul it had ever taken, each one looking at her, asking, "Will you build again?" And Eleanor whispered, not yes, not no, but the only truth she had left, "I remember." And in that moment, the house opened its eyes. It blinked without blinking. That's the only way Eleanor could describe it. The moment the house opened its eyes, everything stilled. Not with silence, but with an awareness so sharp it felt like the air itself had turned to glass. She stood inside the salt circle, surrounded by walls that pulsed with memory, a mirror that no longer reflected, and a presence that had stopped pretending to be a house. It wasn't architecture. It never was. It was a thought, old and endless, carved into spaces, whispered through door frames, painted in the quiet moments between screams. And now that it had opened its eyes, it saw her. Not just her skin, not her face. It saw the depth of her, every version, every possible ending, every unraveling, every rebuild. It saw the girl in the mirror, the woman who clawed her way out of the trap, the one who named the unnameable and walked away. But Eleanor didn't move. She didn't run. She let it look. Because she wasn't afraid of being seen anymore. She was afraid of what she might see in return. And when the mirror rippled again, it showed her something she hadn't drawn, not once, not even in her most fevered sketches. A door, old wood, bound in iron, its handle slick with rot and time, and behind it laughter. Not mocking, not joyous, but hungry. The house had something left, one last secret, one final vault beneath all the others. And Eleanor understood Velmir had only been a guardian, a guard dog with too much ego and not enough wisdom. But what slept behind that door was the source of it all. Not the creator of the house. No, not even that. But the reason why the house kept building itself. Why it could never stop. Why it always needed more names, more mirrors, more minds to wear. It was the thing that demanded growth, and it was still waiting to be fed. She left the salt circle. The mirror didn't stop her, because now it trusted her. Or maybe it knew it didn't have a choice. Eleanor was the only one who had made it this far, the only one who had lived through being swallowed and spat back out. She had walked through every layer of the lie and still remembered who she was. That made her dangerous. That made her necessary. She followed the shifting hallway the mirror had revealed. With every step, the air changed, grew denser, more aware. It felt like walking into a story being written around her in real time. The walls etched themselves as she passed, scratches forming into words, then sentences, then entire memories not her own. She saw a boy's first lie carved above a doorframe, a woman's final thought etched into the ceiling tiles, 100 forgotten goodbyes inked into the floor beneath her feet. This wasn't just the heart of the house. This was its library. And somewhere within this chronicle of sorrow and obsession was the beginning. The place where the hunger started. She found the door at the end of a staircase that had no steps, just a descent through shadow. The door was breathing. It expanded and contracted like lungs that had never drawn clean air. When she touched it, it felt warm, too warm. Like touching the chest of someone who had been running through nightmares. She took a breath, braced herself, and opened it. Inside was not a room. It was a memory. Not hers. Not even the house's. It was older than both. She stepped through and found herself in a world of red, Not blood, not fire, just endless red light stretching in every direction like a sunset that never ends. And in the center a figure, bent, twisted, wearing a robe of keys. Its face was blank, smooth skin stretched over bone without eye sockets, without mouth, without shape. But it turned toward her, and spoke without sound. It asked a question, and she heard it not with her ears, but with her teeth. Will you feed me again? That was what the house had always been about. Not fear, not punishment, but feeding. Feeding this thing, this thought, this origin. It didn't need bodies, it needed meaning. Regret, memory, identity. It ate identity, and Velmur. Velmur was just a name it used when the food got too clever. But Eleanor had cut that name loose. Now it wanted a new one, and it wanted her to give it. The circle was complete. If she named it, this root, this god of hunger, it would be hers to command. But at what cost? What would she become? Would she still be Eleanor? Or just another whisper behind another mirror? The figure stepped forward, its robe of keys clinking like bones. It held out a hand, not to take, but to offer. In its palm a mirror shard, old blackened, and in it not her face, but potential. A version of her who accepted, who built the next house, who grew it smarter, stronger, who made it beautiful and endless and inescapable. The figure waited. The house held its breath. The red light dimmed. And Eleanor, she didn't speak. She reached into her pocket, pulled out the torn page with Velmur's name, held it next to the shard, and let them touch. The paper burned. The mirror cracked. The figure shrieked, not with anger, with loss, because it needed a new name to grow again. And she had just made sure no name would ever take root again. I won't feed you, she whispered. Not ever again. And she turned her back on it, walked into the light. The red began to peel. The figure dissolved. The hallway behind her shrank. The walls folded. And the house. The house didn't scream. It collapsed into silence. Not the kind that waits to speak again, but the kind that means something is truly gone. When she stepped back into the world, the cliffside house was nothing but ash. No wind, no rain, just quiet, and Eleanor standing alone, holding a shard that no longer reflected anything but sky. She smiled for the first time in her life. Not because it was over, but because it would never begin again. Ash should scatter. That's what Eleanor expected. When the wind returned, weak but steady, she thought the remnants of the cliffside house would lift and vanish, carried away grain by grain until nothing remained. But the ash didn't move. It clung to the earth, heavy, wet like bone dust soaked in memory. It settled not like the end of a fire, but like the start of a burial. She stood in it, bare feet blackened, the silence thick and humming under her skin. This wasn't peace. This was something else. Something worse. Because she could still hear it. Not the voice. Not the names. Those were gone. Velmur was ash now, and the hunger that fed it had been denied. But something had watched that ending. Something had seen her say no. Had seen her burn the last name, refuse the crown of the architect, turn her back on the primal hunger that had ruined so many lives. Something deeper than the house. Not its builder. Not even its first feeder. But the thing that waited beneath the ashes. And now it knew her. That was the sickness of silence. It wasn't an absence of sound. It was a presence. Coiled. Listening. A week passed. Then another. Eleanor returned to the city, blending into the chaos of forgotten lives and routine noise. The streets were louder than she remembered. Car horns. Sirens. People shouting into phones, arguing on corners, laughing too loud. It was a kind of music. Ugly, but real. And she clung to it. Because the silence followed her like a second shadow. Every time she closed her eyes, she felt the press of the ash. Not on her skin, inside it. She kept the mirror shard, wore it around her neck like a charm no one understood. A piece of a weapon from a war no one would ever believe happened. She thought about throwing it away. Many times. But each time she tried, her fingers froze. Not from fear, from recognition. That shard wasn't just a fragment of the house. It was the only thing still watching her, and sometimes it twitched. That's when the dreams returned. Not hers, not anyone's. Just void, deep, aching void, filled with rooms that had never existed. Rooms with no corners. Staircases that led to nowhere. Chairs that rocked without touch. And always, at the center of the dream, a door. Sometimes wooden, sometimes steel. Once made entirely of skin. But the message was always the same. It was waiting for her to open it. She resisted. But dreams are patient. Dreams remember longer than flesh. One morning, she awoke to find ash on her windowsill. Not windblown, not tracked in, placed. A neat little line of gray, like someone, or something, had traced the border between the inside and outside of her life. She swept it away. But the message was clear. Velmer had burned. But the thing beneath it had not. And now that she'd denied it, it had become curious. It didn't scream. It didn't lash out. It just waited and began testing her. A voicemail on her phone, static and nothing else, but when played backward, she could hear her own voice saying a name she didn't recognize. A man on the subway holding a sketch of a door, glancing up at her with eyes that weren't quite real, before folding it and walking away. Children humming lullabies she'd only ever heard inside the hospital. The house hadn't come back. It didn't need to, because it had never been a place. It had always been an invitation, and by surviving it, by denying it, she had made herself a target. No longer food. Now, a threat. That's when she realized what the sickness truly was. It wasn't what the house had taken. It was what it had left behind. The knowing. The awareness. The need. She wasn't hungry. But part of her had started to miss the labyrinth. The structure. The focus. The clarity of being hunted. Now she was just drifting. A ghost wearing skin. And the silence whispered promises. Not with words, but with possibility. Build again, it suggested. Not for them. For you. Make it better. Make it honest. She fought it. Clung to noise. Started leaving the TV on at night. Started walking crowded streets just to feel other heartbeats nearby. Started humming. Badly, off, key, on purpose. Just to prove she still had voice. But the silence was always patient. And then one night, she opened the notebook. The one she swore she'd never touch again. The pages were blank. Every single one. Even the ones she remembered filling with pain. Gone. As if the story had never happened. As if she had never existed at all. The mirror shard around her neck cracked. Just slightly. But enough to bleed. And she realized the truth. You don't escape the house. You bury it. And pray it doesn't grow roots. She picked up a pencil. Stared at the empty page. And without meaning to, her hand began to move. Not sketching. Not designing. Just naming. And the name that came wasn't Velmer. It was something older. Something she didn't even know she knew. And when she finished writing it, the mirror shard shattered. The lights in her apartment went out. And the silence. It smiled. The moment Eleanor saw the name on the page, her vision blurred. Not from tears. She didn't feel sadness anymore. But from pressure. Like her own mind recoiled at what she had written. Even though the letters were hers, even though the hand that held the pencil was still attached to her wrist, the words stared up at her from the page, not in ink, but in blood. Fresh, bright, still wet, but she hadn't cut herself, she hadn't bled. It was as if the name itself had pierced something deeper, some part of the world that shouldn't be visible, let alone written on cheap notebook paper in a quiet apartment at midnight. She didn't try to pronounce it. The letters didn't allow that. They curved and twisted in unnatural ways, looping into themselves, impossible to sound aloud. Just looking at them made her ears ring, her teeth ache. The name hadn't come from her. It had come through her. The power in the apartment flickered violently. Every bulb strobed, humming with energy like they were about to scream. Her TV blared static for a split second, then cut to black. The shadows in the corners of the room grew thick, darker than dark, alive and watching. And through it all, that word on the page began to pulse. Not metaphorically. Literally. The paper throbbed like a heart, and with each pulse, the air around her grew heavier, tighter, more aware. Eleanor backed away slowly. The mirror shard, now shattered, lay in pieces at her feet. She crouched, picked one up. It was cold, but not dead. It twitched in her hand like something still breathing. She held it close and glanced back at the notebook, only to find the name had changed. Not the word, just the way it looked. The letters had started to grow, stretching beyond the edges of the paper, curling off the page like tendrils of smoke, trying to write themselves into the room. Eleanor dropped the shard and slammed the notebook shut. The pulse stopped. The air collapsed back into stillness. But the silence that followed wasn't the cold absence of sound. It was the inhale before the scream. She knew what she had done. She hadn't just named something. She had called it. And now it was coming. The house had been an echo of a deeper hunger. Velmure had been its puppet. But this name was the source of all of it. The seed. She had drawn it without meaning to, but meaning wasn't required. Only memory. And the house had buried just enough of its own past inside her to make her useful again. She didn't sleep that night. How could she? She spent the hours until dawn watching the notebook. It never moved again. But that was the trick. It didn't need to. The name was inside her now, in the bones behind her eyes, in the pulse at her throat, in the dreams she no longer had but still somehow remembered. By morning, the walls of her apartment felt closer, the windows smaller. She stood in front of the mirror and saw herself, but not alone. There was something just behind her shoulder, not visible, not even a blur, but a pressure, a presence, like a second skin made of shadow. She said her own name aloud, just to hear something real. Eleanor Blake. Her voice cracked on the second syllable, and she felt it. The thing inside her twitch. That was when she understood the sickness wasn't silence anymore. It was containment. She was now the house. The blueprint wasn't outside her. It was written in muscle, in memory, in marrow. And the name, the one that bled from her notebook, was waiting to be spoken aloud, waiting to be released. It didn't want her dead. It wanted her open, so it could crawl through her mouth and wear her skin like its next sanctuary. She wouldn't let it. Not again. Not ever. But resisting wasn't enough this time. She had already called it. She had already let it in. The only way to keep it from taking full shape was to finish what the house started. To find the place where the name had first been spoken, and unmake it, which meant going back, not to the hospital, not to the house, but to the land before the structure, where the earth still remembered what had been buried there. She dug through old files, old case notes, searched for the earliest known mention of the property that would one day become Black Hollow. And she found it, half, lost in a redacted report from nearly a century ago, Sanctuary Grounds, unincorporated parish, originally owned by the Velmore family. Not Velmure, Velmore. Close, not quite the same, like a name whispered through time, worn down by repetition and fear. The report mentioned a ruin, a foundation deeper than any known structure in the region, located on a stretch of land no longer listed on maps. But she knew where to find it, because she had drawn it, before she ever saw the report. In one of the dream sketches she never dared finish, she packed nothing but the notebook, left the apartment as the lights dimmed behind her, as the shadow on the wall stayed perfectly still even after she walked away. The city faded, the roads emptied, and soon she was walking, mile after mile of dead fields and old trees, until finally she found it. A flat stone circle, half covered in moss, too symmetrical to be natural, too forgotten to be harmless. And there, carved into its center, was the original name. Not Velmure. Not Velmore. Not even a name in letters she could recognize. Just shapes. And the moment she stepped into the circle, the silence spoke again. Not in sound, but in pressure. And this time, it knew her name too. It said, "You were never meant to survive us." And she said back, "That's why I did." Then she opened the notebook, ripped out the page with the bleeding word, placed it on the stone, and set it on fire. It didn't burn. It screamed. The flame roared without heat. The moss turned to ash. The sky cracked open, and something that had been waiting for 1,000 years shuddered, not in rage, not in pain, but in fear. Because it had been named, and now it had been denied. Eleanor turned from the ruin, and as she walked away, her reflection, somewhere far, far behind her, blinked first. The world did not break when the name was burned, but something older exhaled. It wasn't the sky, though clouds thinned like skin stretched too far. It wasn't the ground, though the earth below the ruined circle shifted uneasily, as though something within it rolled over in its sleep. No, it was time that seemed to release a breath it had been holding since the name was first whispered. And Eleanor, standing in the dead center of a place where language had once gone feral, felt that breath move through her like wind through cracked walls. She waited for the usual aftermath, some flash of pain, a shift in the air, an omen dressed in silence. But none came. Instead, everything around her felt still. Too still. Not with peace, but with expectation. Like the moment after a question that no one dares answer. She walked. Not because she had a destination, but because she didn't trust the ground beneath her to stay inert if she stood still too long. The woods surrounding the ruin looked older now, like they'd remembered just how long they had been here. Trees leaned closer together, their bark blackened as though they had been scorched from the inside. The path she took to arrive, so clear only hours ago, was gone, replaced by thorns and silence and watching. And yet she wasn't afraid. Not the way she used to be, because Eleanor had crossed too many thresholds to fear the darkness now. What she feared, what still curled beneath her ribs like a shard of cold glass, was the feeling that something remained. Something not named, not drawn, not trapped in wood or mirror or memory. Something that had never needed a structure to survive. Something that had simply waited. The silence that followed her no longer whispered or promised. It simply was. A presence without voice, but heavy enough to warp sound, enough to shift the shape of moments. She reached the tree line just as dusk began to cut the sky in half. The light went soft and strange, as if filtering through a film of smoke. Though nothing burned, she saw shadows lengthen unnaturally, not in response to the sun, but in response to her. They tilted toward her footsteps, leaned into her shape, and retreated only when she looked straight at them. The town she returned to was not the one she remembered. Not because the buildings had changed, but because she had. Everything looked smaller, hollow. People moved like echoes of themselves. Familiar faces felt like masks. Even her own reflection in the windows of shops and buses didn't align perfectly with her expression. It smiled when she didn't, blinked too slow, stood just a breath too still. It was as if the version of her that had survived the house now existed half a step ahead of reality. And then came the dreams again. This time, they were hers. Not fed to her by the house or its whispers, but born from her own memory. She dreamed of her mother, who she hadn't spoken of in years. Not since the hospital days. Not since the first time she'd heard Velmir's name. In the dream, her mother stood in a room Eleanor had never seen before, but it felt familiar, sparse, cold, the walls too far apart. The floor stained with something that pulsed beneath the boards. Her mother said one thing. I tried to forget it too. Then vanished. Eleanor woke up drenched in sweat, heart pounding, and the mirror across from her bed had fogged over despite the room being cold. And written in that fog, clear as breath, "Then why did you write it?" She didn't remember standing up. Didn't remember walking to the mirror. But she remembered wiping the words away, not with her hand, but with her forehead pressed to the glass. The next morning, the newspaper stand on her block ran a front page story about a church fire in a neighboring town. No survivors. No identified cause. Just ash and melted wood where the altar used to be. The name of the town. Velmore. A place that hadn't existed on any map she'd ever seen. Not until she had spoken it aloud. The silence had changed its tactic. It wasn't trying to haunt her now. It was trying to punish her. Every piece she remembered, every thread she tried to tie off, it unraveled in reverse. Turned her truth into someone else's curse. It was as if the very act of remembering the story had become a weapon the thing could now use against her. Eleanor knew she had to vanish again. Leave the city, leave people behind. Because this time, the horror wasn't confined to a place. It had latched to her name. Wherever she went, the echoes followed, sometimes in small ways. An old woman staring too long from a window. A child humming a song that hadn't existed since the asylum burned. Sometimes in louder ones. A missing persons report for someone who spoke to her just hours before. A police sketch of a man who'd drawn a spiral on his walls and disappeared screaming, claiming the woman with the blood. Word had visited him. The stories were multiplying, spreading, and she was the source code. The first infected page. So she did the only thing left. She stopped speaking, stopped writing, broke every pen she owned, burned the last notebook, smashed the last remaining piece of mirror she kept hidden in the lining of her coat. She wrapped herself in silence, not to summon it, but to starve it. And for a while it worked. Days passed, then weeks. She moved like a shadow through towns no one remembered, slept in bus stations, ate only when needed, never spoke, never dreamed. And the silence stopped pushing, but it never left. It waited. She could feel it, coiled in her bones, humming in the blood behind her teeth. Not active, not gone. Just waiting for her to breathe the wrong word again. Because the truth she now carried wasn't about the house. It wasn't about names or echoes or hunger. It was about legacy. Some horrors don't die when you destroy their home. They embed in the one who survives. And now, she was the last door. And she hadn't figured out yet whether to keep it locked. Or open it just wide enough to end this, once and for all. She had become the last door. Eleanor understood that now. Not in metaphor, not in abstract, but in her marrow, in the parts of her no mirror ever showed. The door wasn't just symbolic, it was literal. Somewhere in her, whether in mind, memory, or something deeper, there was a lock, a seal that held back what no house, no name, no structure had ever fully contained. And it was creaking, slowly, patiently, as if testing her, waiting for the tiniest fracture to let itself through. For weeks, she wandered in silence, as though the hush could keep it at bay. And for a time, it did. Not perfectly. There were moments when strangers would pause beside her on the street, not because they recognized her, but because something behind their eyes did. They'd linger half a second too long, pupils dilated, lips twitching toward a name they didn't consciously know. Then the moment would pass. They'd move on. And Eleanor would keep walking, heart silent, mouth shut. It wasn't until she reached the edge of the coast that the illusion of safety began to rot. The town was small, clinging to the cliffs like it knew the ocean wanted to pull it under. Its name, Braithmore, meant nothing to her. It was as unremarkable as any forgotten port town should be. But the moment her boots touched its weather-worn road, the air changed. The silence didn't deepen, it thinned, became brittle, and she realized then this town had a wound, not bleeding, not screaming, just open, exposed, and whatever had scarred it had the same taste as the thing inside her. The locals didn't ask questions, they watched. Some nodded, not out of kindness, but out of recognition. As if they'd seen her before, but only from dreams they weren't supposed to remember. The shopkeeper who handed her bread refused her money. The child who passed her on the road whispered a word she didn't understand, and then immediately cried, without knowing why. She took a room above an abandoned inn. It had no name, no staff, just a key left on the counter, and a door that creaked open as if expecting her. The wallpaper was peeling. The windows wouldn't open. But the view showed the sea, and that was enough. Not for peace. There was no peace left, but for distance, for perspective, because out there, past the cliffs, beyond the tide, something called. Not loudly, not even constantly, just occasionally. A soft tug in the gut, a flicker in her periphery. It wanted her to look, to remember, to go down. And so, on the third night, she did. The cliffs sloped gently at first, then steeply. She moved carefully, fingers brushing stone that felt too warm, too alive. The tide had pulled back unusually far that evening, revealing a shoreline littered with things she couldn't name. Bones in patterns, glass jars full of breath, doors without hinges half buried in salt. She followed the path she hadn't known was there, worn into the sand like a trail of footsteps left by someone who walked in circles until the world forgot them. And then she saw it, half submerged in the water. A structure, not a house. A vault, round seamless. Blacker than the night sky, absorbing light instead of reflecting it. It pulsed, like the name had pulsed on her page, and carved above its sealed entrance, a phrase WHT wow you bury livs longar. She stared at the words. Then at the vault. It had no handle, no visible keyhole, but she knew she was the key, not her hands, not her blood, not her will, her memory. The thing inside her, the name she had written, burned, buried, had found its true resting place. And now, it was asking to be returned, to be locked away in the one vault designed to contain it properly. She didn't move, didn't speak. She simply sat, cross-legged, at the base of the vault, the sea whispering around her, the salt clinging to her skin like dust from old books. She stayed that way for hours, because she understood the cost. To seal the name in that vault wouldn't just mean letting it go. It would mean letting herself go with it. It was tied to her now, threaded into her thoughts, her body, her bones. To lock it away forever, she'd have to lock herself in with it. No escape, no mirror, no voice, just darkness and silence. But the silence was no longer cruel. It didn't whisper anymore. It waited, and for the first time in months, she felt it wasn't hunting her. It was offering mercy, not forgiveness, never that, but an end, a final, true ending, if she chose it. A seagull called overhead, a sound too loud, too clean. It broke the moment like a crack across a frozen lake. She blinked, and stood, walked slowly to the vault, raised one hand, and felt the seam open, not like a door, but like a mouth, parting to take back what never should have escaped. She stepped inside. There was no scream, no storm, no flood, just a long exhale, and like time itself letting go. And as the vault sealed behind her, the sea crept back in, eroding the trail, swallowing the bones, drowning the last door, but not in fear, in completion. Eleanor Blake's name would never be spoken again, not because it was forgotten, but because it was now buried exactly where it belonged. They say the sea forgets everything, that it grinds down ships into dust, carries away bones until they're nameless, turns screams into bubbles lost beneath the tide. But some things even the ocean won't take. Some things it only holds. The vault, black and seamless beneath the waves, did not drift, did not decay. It remained anchored in the bedrock, untouched by current, unseen by life, and deeper than death. Inside there was no time, no light, no sound. Only pressure, constant, heavy, like a thought that never stops repeating. And in that pressure Eleanor existed. Not asleep, not awake, not gone. She had not died when she stepped inside. Death would have been simpler, cleaner. But the vault was not a tomb, it was a lock. One that required a conscious key. And she was the last keeper of the name that could not be spoken. So she remained, seated in the middle of the smooth, dark chamber, surrounded by nothing, holding it closed with her very presence. It didn't speak to her anymore. The name, the hunger, the thing without shape that once wore mirrors and houses and sorrow like skin. It had stopped whispering, because it knew she wouldn't listen. But knowing that didn't make it quiet. It waited. It pulsed in the marrow of her bones, not with need, but with possibility. That was the danger. Not that it could break free on its own, but that someone else might try to find it. Someone curious. Someone desperate. Someone who heard the faintest echo of what it once was and thought they could control it. Eleanor could feel those tremors sometimes, distant and vague, like footsteps above her head in a building long abandoned, people saying the wrong things, asking questions, digging. She could feel the threads tugging, faint, but real, and every time they pulled, the vault around her seemed to tighten, as if reminding her of the weight she held in check. She thought of the others sometimes. The ones who hadn't made it this far. Those who'd entered the house and never left. Faces long gone, names eaten by the silence. What remained of them now? Were they fragments inside her? Echoes within the vault? Or had they simply ceased? She didn't know. Didn't let herself wonder too long, because wondering invited memory, and memory invited cracks. Time passed strangely, if it passed at all. She stopped marking it. There was no light to measure days, no hunger to measure hours. Only herself, breathing, watching, listening, holding the name down like a lid over a screaming mouth. She thought maybe this was peace, not the freedom kind, but the still kind. The kind that doesn't move because it can't. But peace is a myth in stories like these, especially when the vault isn't forgotten. Above the waves in the quiet town of Braithmore, the shoreline began to change. Strange patterns surfaced in the sand after storms, symbols that didn't match any language. Birds flew in odd spirals. Windows cracked without reason. And some nights, the fog rolled in too thick, too fast, carrying whispers with no mouths to speak them. And then, the dreams returned, not to Eleanor, to others. The girl on the cliffs who drew spirals in her journal. The fisherman who began sleepwalking and waking with seawater in his lungs. The priest who sealed the church doors and claimed the sea was trying to confess. They dreamed of a woman sealed in black stone, a woman who breathed in silence, and a word they couldn't say, but still heard, a word that tasted like rust and fire and forgotten grief. And so, they searched, not together, not aloud, but one by one, drawn by something they didn't understand. They began digging, beneath the rocks, under the tide, searching for the vault, for the door, and inside Eleanor felt it. A shift, small, but there, like a breath held too long finally released. She opened her eyes that had not seen light in what felt like eternity, and she knew someone was close. The vault didn't tremble. It welcomed. Because it had been patient, it knew this moment would come, not with fire, not with blood, but with curiosity. Curiosity always opens more doors than rage ever could. The silence coiled tighter, not as warning, but as invitation. Because it only needed one mistake. One hand placed on the wrong stone. One whisper said with a bit too much belief. One soul who thought they were different. And then the lock would slip. Eleanor leaned forward, pressed both palms to the smooth, dark floor. Her voice, dry from years of disuse, cracked as she finally spoke. Not the forbidden name, but the one thing that still gave her strength. No. It echoed through the vault, soft but sharp, like a knife dropped in water. No, she repeated. You will not wear me. The silence hissed. But it didn't fight, because it still remembered her refusal, still remembered the fire in her eyes as she walked into the ruin and said no to eternity. But the vault didn't fear her. It needed her. And it would keep her breathing for as long as it could, because Eleanor Blake was the last door. And as long as she lived, it could still hope, still wait, still plot, not escape, but rebirth, one curious hand at a time. And the moment that hand arrived, it would be ready. There is a lie we tell ourselves about endings, that they are permanent. That once something is buried, it stays buried. That a sealed door remains shut just because we walked away from it. But Eleanor, curled in the vault beneath the sea, knew the truth endings rot. They leak, they hum, And when no one is watching, they begin to shift back into beginnings. She had been the guardian that lie for longer than memory allowed. But now, she felt it. Something had cracked. Not broken, not shattered. Just flexed, like a muscle stretching after long sleep. It began with breath. Not hers, someone else's. A stuttering inhale, sharp and confused. Like someone waking from a nightmare they didn't remember falling into. Eleanor felt it before she heard it. Pressure changing. Water trembling around the edges of the vault's seal. The air inside hadn't moved in years, but now it stirred. Slightly. Hesitantly. The kind of movement that doesn't announce itself. The kind that waits to see if it's been noticed. She didn't move. Didn't even blink. Because if she acknowledged it, it might become real. But real things don't wait for permission. On the surface, in Braithmore, a boy had been sleepwalking. Only 13, mute since the drowning of his sister the year before. His parents thought he was grieving, that the silence was his armor. But something else had wrapped around him in that first dream. Something older than grief, older than language. He dreamed of stairs that led down forever, and when he woke, his feet were wet. The next night, he walked farther, down to the shore. Barefoot in the dark, he didn't wake up, not this time. He walked straight into the sea, silent, eyes open, heading not toward the horizon, but downward, as if answering a call beneath the waves. He didn't drown. The water parted for him, and Eleanor felt it. The moment his foot touched the seabed above the vault, she gasped, a sound that hadn't left her lungs in years. Not from pain, not from fear, from recognition. She didn't know the boy, but the thing inside her did. It remembered why it waited. It didn't want just any soul, it wanted an heir. Someone young enough, blank enough, quiet enough to carry the seed forward. The boy had no name for it, no desire, but his silence made him ripe. And now he stood at the threshold. Eleanor pushed herself to her knees, breath ragged, hands trembling. The vault wasn't just reacting, it was preparing. Stones beneath her glowed faintly now. Etch it with the same impossible shapes she'd once burned into her notebook. Shapes that hummed now, sensing to the boy's heartbeat. She pressed her palms to the floor. No, she whispered. Not again. But the vault didn't answer her, because it wasn't listening to her anymore. It was listening to the boy. He was closer now. Inside the vault, a faint seam of light split across the far wall. The vault was opening itself, not by force, by invitation. Eleanor stood, though her legs screamed in protest. Her body was thin, nearly translucent, like she'd been whittled down to essence. But her will was still solid. She placed her hand over the widening crack and hissed, "You will not take him." And that's when it spoke again, not with words, with memory. It showed her the boy's pain, his loneliness, the stillness that had built around him like a second skin. It didn't try to deceive her. It didn't offer lies. It offered truth, because it knew Eleanor's weakness. She understood what silence could do to a soul, and this child had been wrapped in it for too long. This is mercy. The vault pulsed. Let him hold it. He will not fight it like you. But Eleanor did not loosen her grip. She pressed her whole body against the seam, panting, shaking, and whispered, "He is not yours." The light dimmed slightly, but the boy was already kneeling above. His small hand touched the stone. And for a heartbeat, a single, damning moment, Eleanor saw through him, saw the future that could bloom if she failed. He wouldn't become a monster. He'd become something worse, a builder, not of houses, but of voices, of places that whispered and fed and spread. He wouldn't need walls or mirrors or salt. He would carry the hunger in every word he didn't say. And people would follow him, never knowing they were walking into a silence that watched. Eleanor screamed. Not a word, just a sound, raw, cracked, real. And for the first time in decades, the vault recoiled. The crack slammed shut. The glow vanished. The boy above fell back into the water, not drowning, just asleep, lifted by the tide like a promise unfulfilled. the vault hissed. But she didn't move. She stayed there, hands against stone, forehead slick with sweat, mouth full of blood from biting her own tongue to stay present. And she said, "Not this time." The silence throbbed, but it did not answer. Because now it feared her, not because she had power, but because she had endurance. The boy would wake hours later on the shore, dazed, confused. The tide would be calm, the sea would be still, and in his mind, the dream would already be fading. He would never return. But Eleanor knew others would come. The vault wasn't a place anymore. It was an idea, and ideas don't die. They wait. They whisper. And unless someone is always listening, always holding the door with their body and mind and breath, they slip out. She sat again, cross-legged in the dark, a door holding itself shut with bones and will. Not because she was chosen, but because she chose, and she whispered, "I will hold you forever if I must." And the vault said nothing, but the silence wept. In the beginning, there had been a house, a labyrinth, a mirror, a whisper that wanted a name. There had been stairs that bled, doors that breathed, a girl who became a key, and silence that watched like a god with no eyes. All of that had burned, been buried, denied. But even now, at the end of all things, the story did not die, because stories never do, not truly. They wait dormant, nested in the cracks of memory, in the spaces between breaths, waiting for someone to listen again. Eleanor knew this. She had always known. The silence had not been her enemy. Not exactly. It had been a mirror too. A reflection of something deeper, older, not a hunger, not even a presence. But a reminder that when people forget the rules of story, the stories rewrite the people. That was what the vault had become. A story too heavy for the world above to hold. And Eleanor was its spine, bent and burning, but still unbroken. Time had left her. There were no minutes in the vault. No hunger, no sleep, just presence. She no longer remembered how long she had been there, but she remembered why. Every now and then, she felt them, the ones above, those who touched the edges of what she had sealed. Not out of malice, but out of instinct, because that's what humans do. They dig, they search, they ask, and sometimes, just sometimes, they accidentally answer. The silence would surge when that happened, not fully, just a ripple, a test. It would press outward, looking for cracks, for gaps in her will. And every time, she would meet it. Not with rage, not with sorrow, but with the same steady defiance, not through me. But the silence wasn't the only thing waiting anymore. Something else had awakened. Not a presence, not a shape, an understanding. Eleanor had been holding the vault shut for what felt like eternity. But now, in the fibers of her soul, in the weight behind her ribs, she felt something changing. Not in the vault, but in her. The pressure wasn't pressing out anymore. It was pressing in. As though the silence wasn't trying to escape, but trying to become part of her. At first, she fought it. Pushed it back like she always had. But this time, the silence didn't lash. Didn't scream. It spoke. Not with a voice, but with a question. What happens when the door forgets what it's holding back? Eleanor froze, because she didn't know. She had become the seal, the guardian. But what if that role wasn't meant to last forever? What if, in trying to contain the name, the hunger, the absence, she had bound herself to it so tightly that it no longer needed to escape? What if it had already won, simply by being remembered? No. She shook the thought from her skull, teeth clenched, blood in her throat. That was the trick. That was always the trick. The silence didn't want to be let out. It wanted to convince her to open the door from the inside. She stood. Her bones didn't creak anymore. They didn't move like flesh. She was no longer a person in the traditional sense. More a thought wrapped in shape. A decision given breath. She walked to the wall of the vault, where the shapes still pulsed in that slow, eternal rhythm. Her hand hovered over them. The glyphs weren't glowing, they were remembering, and in them she saw it. Not the house, not the spiral, not even the boy, but herself. The first time she stood at the edge of the asylum ruin, before the mirror, before the madness, before the silence found her. And in that image, she saw a choice she had never made: to walk away, to never enter the house, to let the story fade like all the others. She pressed her palm to the stone. The glyphs warmed. The silence held its breath. And Eleanor said, "I could have been nothing." The vault shuddered. She leaned in. "But I chose this." And in that moment, something shifted. Not in the vault, but in the story. Because the silence had always depended on need. On holes. On people searching for something to fill the ache. But Eleanor had stopped aching a long time ago. She didn't need to be remembered. She didn't need to be freed. She didn't even need to win. She just needed to hold. And so she did. The silence pushed one last time. Soft, almost tender, as if saying, "You're not strong enough forever." And Eleanor whispered back, "Then I'll be strong enough until..." The vault's light faded. Its pulse slowed. And the world above, for the first time in centuries, slept without dreams. Eleanor sat down again, a shape in the dark, not alone, but unbroken. She was no longer the door. She was the warning etched across the frame. The message no one would read, but everyone would feel: "You may knock, but I will never answer." And in that refusal, the silence was sealed, not by locks, not by spells, but by the simplest force of all, a soul that would never give it permission.